I've been a police officer for 12 years now, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on the night of June 13th. It was my first midnight shift in months, and I remember the radio crackling to life as soon as I signed on. "Unit 1307, we've got a 10 to 56 at Baker and Elm," the dispatcher said, code for a possible suicide. "Copy that. En route," I replied, grabbing my flashlight and heading to my cruiser. When I got there, the street was completely empty. No cars, no bystanders, nothing. It was just me, the glow of my headlights, and the faint flicker of a streetlight at the far end of the block. I scanned the area but couldn't see anyone. Dispatch confirmed the call came from this exact location just 5 minutes ago. Then, I saw it, a figure standing on the roof of an old abandoned apartment building. They were swaying slightly, teetering on the edge, silhouetted against the moonlight. I called out, "This is Officer Taylor with the NYPD. Step back from the ledge." No response. I was about to radio for backup when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't alone. A second shape seemed to rise out of the shadow behind them. Something tall and hunched, with unnaturally long limbs. It was just barely visible, its form flickering in and out of existence like static on an old TV. Before I could process what I was seeing, the person on the ledge turned to face me. Even from the ground, I could see their eyes, wide, glassy, and glowing faintly in the darkness. They raised a hand, pointed at me, and then stepped backward off the ledge. I didn't even hear the impact. I sprinted toward the building, my heart hammering against my ribs. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that I'd seen jumpers before. But there was something wrong about this one, something I couldn't shake. When I reached the body, I froze. There wasn't any blood, no broken bones, no visible injuries. The person, a man in his mid-30s, was lying on the cracked pavement, staring straight up at the sky. His lips were moving, whispering something too faint to hear. I leaned closer, trying to catch the words. "What are you saying?" I asked, keeping my hand on my holster just in case. His eyes shifted toward me, wide and unblinking. "It's coming," he croaked. His voice was barely above a whisper, but those two words cut through me like a blade. Before I could respond, his head jerked violently to the side, and his body went still. I instinctively checked his pulse, but there was nothing. He was gone. Then the air around me changed. It's hard to describe exactly what happened. It felt like the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The streetlights flickered and dimmed until they cast nothing but faint halos of light. My radio crackled with static, and for a split second, I thought I heard a voice whispering my name. I stood up, scanning my surroundings. That's when I saw it again. The shadowy figure from the roof. It was standing in the middle of the street now, taller than any human, its outline rippling like smoke in a breeze. My hand went to my gun. "Police, stop where you are," I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't move. It didn't even seem to acknowledge me. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed toward the alley behind the building. I didn't want to go, but something compelled me to move. It wasn't curiosity. It was like my feet weren't my own anymore. I turned my flashlight on and stepped into the darkness of the alley. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was thick and cloying, a mix of rotting meat and burnt plastic. My stomach churned, but I pressed on. The beam of my flashlight illuminated graffiti-covered walls, old dumpsters, and piles of trash. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until I saw the door. It was metal, rusted and bent, like it had been forced open countless times. A strange symbol was scratched into its surface. something that looked like a combination of a pentagram and a spiral. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I pushed the door open, and my flashlight flickered and died. It started as a routine night shift at the station. You think you know what routine means when you're a cop. Paperwork, bar fights, maybe a domestic disturbance call. But what went down that night? It's why I'll never work alone on night shifts again. We got a call about an abandoned car just off Route 17, near the old Millers Creek Bridge. Dispatch said it had been sitting there for hours, hazard lights blinking in the dark. Normally, I'd have shrugged it off. It's probably just some drunk who couldn't find his keys. But something about the way dispatch sounded. Uneasy. I could hear it in her voice. "Just be careful out there," she said before hanging up. I pulled up to the scene around 11:45 p.m. The bridge was cloaked in fog so thick my squad car's headlights barely pierced through it. The abandoned car was sitting at an awkward angle, half on the road, half off it, like whoever was driving just gave up halfway across the bridge. It was a late-model sedan, gray, forgettable, and the driver's door was wide open. I called it in. "Car's here. No sign of the driver," I said. 10-4, dispatch replied. "Any blood or signs of struggle?" "Negative," I said, stepping out into the biting cold. That's when I noticed it. The air felt wrong. You know that feeling when a storm's coming? That static charge? It was like that, only worse. Like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. The interior of the car looked untouched. Phone on the passenger seat, wallet in the cup holder, keys still dangling from the ignition. And the smell. There was this faint, acrid scent like burnt plastic. I was just leaning in to grab the phone when I heard it. A sound I'll never forget. It started as a whisper, just faint enough to make me think I imagined it. Then it grew louder. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like a hiss, wet and guttural, coming from somewhere under the bridge. My flashlight swept over the edge of the guardrail. My stomach tightened when I saw the marks. Deep, jagged scratches carved into the metal, as if something with claws had been trying to climb up the side. "Unit 415 to dispatch," I said, my voice barely steady. "Possible animal activity under the Millers Creek Bridge. Requesting backup." Static. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Still nothing. Just a high-pitched whine over the radio that made me flinch. Then I heard a splash. Something moving in the water below. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't fish or debris. This was bigger. And it was getting closer. I froze, gripping my flashlight like it could somehow protect me. Every instinct screamed to get back in the car and leave. But the cop in me, the part that didn't want to explain to my sergeant why I ran from an abandoned vehicle, kept me rooted. The sound of splashing stopped. For a moment, the only sound was my own breathing. And then, it happened. A figure emerged from the water. At first, it looked human. A man, hunched over, dragging himself up the embankment below the bridge. His clothes were soaked, hanging off him like dead weight, and his movements were wrong. Jittery, uneven, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. "Sir?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Are you all right?" He didn't respond. Instead, he stopped, head jerking in my direction. His face was shadowed, but the way he tilted his head, it wasn't curiosity. It was predatory. I backed up toward the squad car, my hand hovering over my holster. "I'm a police officer," I said, louder this time. "Do not move. Stay where you are." The figure stood slowly, his body unfolding in unnatural, jerky motions. That's when I noticed something wasn't right about his silhouette. His arms were too long, dangling past his knees. His neck seemed to stretch as he turned his head, craning to one side like he was studying me. "Last warning," I shouted, my heart hammering. "Stay where you are." He didn't listen. Instead, he began to run, not toward me, but toward the car, darting to the open driver's side door like he knew exactly what he was doing. I drew my weapon. "Stop. Hands where I can see them." He didn't stop. He didn't even hesitate. But just as he reached the car, he dropped to all fours and scrambled underneath it, disappearing into the darkness like some kind of feral animal. I didn't move. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it under the car. I couldn't see him. The space was empty, impossibly so. There was no way he could have fit his entire body under there. And yet, he was gone. That's when I heard the voice. A woman's voice, faint and trembling, coming from the woods beyond the bridge. "Help me." I whipped around, my flashlight cutting through the fog. "Hello? Who's there?" "Please," the voice called again, closer this time. "Help me." Against every ounce of common sense, I moved toward the sound. My boots crunched on the gravel as I left the car behind, the beam of my flashlight scanning the tree line. The voice sounded so real, so desperate, but something about it felt off. It was too even, too controlled, like someone trying to mimic distress. And then I saw her. A woman standing just inside the tree line, her back to me. Her clothes were torn, her hair tangled and wet, like she'd just climbed out of the creek. "Ma'am," I called out cautiously, "are you hurt? Do you need assistance?" She didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless. My gut screamed for me to stay back, but I couldn't leave her. "Ma'am, I'm going to approach you, all right? Just stay where you are." As I stepped closer, she began to turn. Slowly. Her head moved first, swiveling unnaturally far before her body followed. And when I saw her face, my blood turned to ice. It wasn't human. Her skin was stretched too tight over her skull, her eyes sunken and black as pits, her mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural smile that split her face from ear to ear. And then she opened it, letting out a sound that still haunts my dreams, a screech, high-pitched and guttural, like 100 voices screaming at once. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. My flashlight dropped, plunging the woods into darkness. And that's when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy, with fingers that felt impossibly long. I spun around, gun drawn, but there was nothing there. Just the fog, swirling thicker now, choking out the light from my car. I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted back to the car, slamming the door and locking it behind me. My hands fumbled for the keys, still dangling from the ignition. As the engine roared to life, the headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the road ahead. And there they were. Not one figure, not two, but dozens. Standing in the middle of the bridge, blocking my way. All of them twisted, unnatural shapes, with limbs that bent the wrong way, and faces that stretched into hollow grins. The woman from the woods was among them. She stood at the front of the group, her head tilted at that same impossible angle, her empty black eyes staring straight at me. I slammed the gear into reverse, but before I could move, they started to walk. Slowly at first, then faster, their movements jerky and inhuman. They swarmed the car, their hands slapping against the windows, smearing them with something dark and wet. My radio crackled to life. "Unit 415, a voice said, cold and mechanical. "Do not leave the vehicle. Do not engage. Do not." The voice cut out, replaced by static. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. My foot slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as I barreled through the crowd. I felt the impact of bodies hitting the car, heard the sickening thuds as they rolled off the hood. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the station, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely park the car. I stumbled inside, breathless and soaked in sweat. But when I tried to explain what happened, my sergeant just stared at me like I was insane. "Route 17's been closed for years," he said. "That bridge was demolished last summer." To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. I don't drive Route 17 anymore, and I don't work night shifts. But every once in a while, when I'm driving alone, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. Figures standing by the side of the road, staring as I pass. And sometimes, if I roll down the window, I swear I can hear them. Help me. You know, some nights, everything just feels off. Like something's watching you from the dark corners, waiting for a moment to make itself known. I learned that feeling the hard way. It was past midnight, and I was patrolling a quiet stretch of Highway 7. I work for a small police department in rural Indiana, population just shy of 2,000. Night shifts were mostly uneventful. Drunk drivers, the occasional animal causing a fender bender, or teenagers smoking pot behind the abandoned sawmill. But that night was different. I'd just finished my usual rounds near the old rail yard and was heading back toward Main Street. The radio buzzed, and my partner, Officer Bradshaw, chimed in. "Hey, Kane," he said. "You hear about that thing over by Eastwood?" Eastwood was barely a blip on the map, about 10 miles out. It used to have a bustling factory that shut down years ago. Now it was a skeleton of its former self, with boarded-up houses and empty streets. "Nah, what thing?" I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. Dispatcher got a call about, I don't even know, man. Some guy freaking out saying his neighbor was acting weird. Real weird. Said he wasn't himself. I chuckled. What? Possession? Shape-shifting lizards? Nah, like staring at him through the window for hours. Kind of weird. Thing is, when the caller tried to confront him, the guy just vanished. I rolled my eyes, but couldn't deny the chill creeping up my neck. You heading out there? Already did. Nothing. The house was empty. No signs of the guy or the neighbor who called it in. Just weird vibes, you know? I didn't reply. Something about his tone unsettled me. About an hour later, I was parked off the side of the highway, sipping lukewarm coffee, when I noticed headlights flickering in my rearview mirror. A beat-up sedan was swerving all over the road, moving fast. I flipped on my lights and followed. The car screeched to a stop on the gravel shoulder. I approached cautiously, one hand on my flashlight and the other resting near my holstered Glock. The driver, a pale, middle-aged man in a sweat-soaked shirt, was shaking uncontrollably. His eyes were bloodshot and darted around like he expected something to lunge at him from the darkness. "Evening," I began, keeping my voice steady. "You okay, sir? You were driving pretty erratically." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared past me, his gaze locked on the woods that lined the highway. "They're following me," he whispered. I frowned. "Who's following you?" "The lights," he hissed. "The fucking lights. They're everywhere. They've been following me since Eastwood." Great. Another drunk conspiracy theorist. I sighed and asked him to step out of the car. As I was questioning him, I noticed something odd. The woods behind him were silent. Not just quiet, completely devoid of sound. No crickets, no wind rustling the leaves. Nothing. That's when the hairs on my neck stood up. The man must have seen my reaction because he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You feel it too, don't you? They're here." Before I could respond, a piercing noise, like static mixed with a high-pitched whine, erupted from the tree line. The man screamed and bolted into the woods. "Hey, stop!" I shouted, drawing my flashlight and chasing after him. The forest swallowed me whole. My boots crunched against the undergrowth as I followed the man's frantic cries. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness. "Sir, stop. It's not safe." Then, silence. I spun around, shining my light in every direction. He was gone. Just gone. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was another flashlight. A dim, pulsating orb of light floated between the trees, maybe 30 feet ahead. But it wasn't a flashlight. The way it moved, slow, deliberate, almost curious. It felt alive. I raised my radio. "Bradshaw, you there?" Static. "Bradshaw, I need backup near mile marker 42. Something's not right out here." More static. The orb suddenly blinked out, plunging the woods back into darkness. My flashlight started flickering. I smacked it against my palm, trying to get it to work. Then I heard it, a wet, gurgling sound, like someone choking on water. It came from behind me. I spun around and nearly dropped my flashlight. The man I'd been chasing was there, but he wasn't right. His body was contorted, limbs bent at impossible angles, like a broken marionette. His head was tilted back, mouth open wide, but no sound came out. And his eyes were glowing, the same pulsating light as the orb. "Stay back!" I shouted, unholstering my gun. He didn't move. I said, "Stay back!" The man's head snapped forward, and he let out an inhuman shriek. Then he lunged at me. I fired. The first shot hit his shoulder. He didn't flinch. The second hit his chest. Still nothing. It wasn't until the third shot, a clean hit to the forehead, that he finally dropped. I stood there, panting, my gun shaking in my hands. The glowing in his eyes faded, and for a moment, he looked normal. Human. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the forest floor. Then the static noise returned, louder this time. It felt like it was drilling into my skull. I turned and ran. By the time I made it back to my cruiser, Bradshaw was waiting for me, looking pale as a ghost. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, staring at the blood on my uniform. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. When backup arrived, we searched the woods. There was no body, no blood, nothing. But I know what I saw. They told me to take some time off, see a therapist. They said it was stress or hallucinations. But every time I close my eyes, I see that man's glowing eyes staring back at me. And I know, deep down, that whatever happened in those woods, it's not over. Not by a long shot. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I took the department's advice and took a few days off, but the static sound haunted my sleep. It wasn't a dream. It was always there, like a faint hum in the back of my mind. Then came the nightmares. I'd see the woods, bathed in pale, flickering light, and hear that wet, choking sound. The man's face would appear, twisted and glowing, his lifeless eyes boring into mine. But every time I reached for my gun in the dream, my hands wouldn't move. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing like I'd been running for miles. But the worst part? Things started happening around town. Reports of the lights. The first incident came from a trucker passing through Eastwood. He called dispatch at 3 a.m., rambling about a floating light near the old factory. Said it followed his rig for almost a mile before vanishing into the woods. 2 days later, a teenager went missing after a late-night joyride with his friends. They told the sheriff they'd seen a weird glowing orb hovering by the abandoned grain silo. The kid got out to take a closer look and never came back. By the end of the week, 6 people had disappeared. The department was scrambling. Search parties scoured the woods. Drones were deployed, but the footage always came back distorted, as if something was interfering with the signal. And then there was Bradshaw. He called me one night, his voice shaky and low. "Kane, they're watching me," he whispered. "What? Who's watching you?" "The lights," he said. "They're outside my house. I don't think they're just lights, man. There's something in them, something alive." I tried to calm him down, told him to stay inside and lock his doors, but the line went dead. I sped to his place, sirens blaring, but by the time I got there, it was too late. His cruiser was in the driveway, door hanging open. The engine was still running. Inside the house, I found his radio smashed on the floor. His gun was lying in the hallway, the clip emptied. And Bradshaw? He was gone. The return to Eastwood, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever this was, it started in Eastwood, and that's where I had to go. I didn't tell anyone. It was just me, my cruiser, and a gut full of dread as I drove down the empty road toward the old factory. When I got there, the air felt thicker, like walking through a storm without the rain. The factory loomed in the distance, its shattered windows like empty eyes, watching me. The static started as soon as I stepped out of the car. It wasn't coming from my radio this time. It was everywhere, vibrating in my skull. My flashlight flickered as I made my way toward the entrance, the beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. Inside, the factory was a maze of rusted machinery and decaying walls. The static grew louder with every step, and soon I started hearing whispers. At first, they were faint, like wind through the cracks in the building. But then they became voices, low and guttural, speaking in a language I didn't understand. And then I saw it. In the center of the factory floor was one of the orbs. But this one was massive, nearly the size of a car. Its surface pulsed and writhed like it was alive, and the air around it shimmered with heat. I raised my gun, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. "Is this what you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. "What the hell are you?" The orb pulsed, and suddenly, it wasn't just light anymore. Figures began to emerge from its surface, their bodies stretching and twisting like they were being molded out of clay. They had no faces, just smooth, featureless heads and long, spindly limbs that moved unnaturally. They started toward me, their movements jerky and inhuman. I fired. The first shot went right through one of them, the bullet ricocheting off the metal wall behind it. It started on a call like any other, a dispatch about a disturbance on Lincoln Avenue, a rundown stretch of road I've driven 1,000 times. Routine, I thought. But nothing about that night would be routine. I'm an officer, and my job is to answer calls, no matter how bizarre they might sound. The caller reported screams, frantic footsteps, and what they described as shadows chasing shadows. Dispatch didn't think it sounded credible, but they sent me anyway. Pulling onto Lincoln Avenue at 3 a.m., I slowed to a crawl. The street was empty, the kind of silence that presses on your ears until you swear you're hearing whispers. My patrol car's headlights cut through the night, bouncing off the cracked windows of old shops and boarded-up buildings. Then I saw her, a woman sprinting down the middle of the street. She was barefoot, wearing a torn dress, her face twisted in sheer terror. I rolled down my window to call out to her, but before I could, she stopped dead in her tracks, her neck snapping around like she'd heard something I couldn't. She screamed, and that's when I saw it. Something moving behind her. But there was nothing there. Not at first. I jumped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and yelled for her to stop. She ran toward me, sobbing, begging for help. Her words were a jumbled mess, but I caught bits and pieces. "It's coming. Invisible. It touched me." Suddenly, she was lifted off the ground. No hands, no wires, nothing. Just her body, rising like a marionette. Her feet dangled in the air as her screams turned to choking gasps. My instinct was to run to her, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like the air around me had turned solid. I could only watch as her body twisted unnaturally, her arms and legs contorting in directions they shouldn't go. Then, her head snapped. She fell to the pavement in a heap, lifeless. The silence returned, thick and heavy. My radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. I approached her cautiously, flashlight shaking in my grip. Her wide, glassy eyes stared up at me, mouth frozen, mid-scream. There were bruises around her neck, bruises that didn't look like they came from human hands. I called for backup, but deep down, I knew no one would believe what I just saw. As I waited, something caught my eye, a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off asphalt. It hovered where the woman had been lifted. My heart pounded as I reached for my gun. The shimmer moved toward me, slow and deliberate. I fired. The bullet hit something. The shimmer flared, twisting like a living thing in pain, then vanished. But the air didn't feel any lighter. Whatever was out there, I knew it wasn't gone. When backup arrived, I didn't tell them everything, just that I found her like that. The official report chalked it up to a hit and run, the case marked unsolved. But I couldn't let it go. That was the night I learned about the Tartarus Archive. But that's a story for another time. For now, just remember, not everything you see on Lincoln Avenue is real, and some things you don't see are more real than you'd like to believe. Weeks passed, but the image of that woman's body didn't leave me. Every night, I drove down Lincoln Avenue on my patrol, scanning for something, anything, to make sense of what happened. But the street stayed empty, a scar on the city's map. I became obsessed. I started digging through old police files, hoping for patterns. Reports of disappearances on Lincoln Avenue dated back decades. Most were written off as runaways, accidents, or unexplainable events buried under paperwork. But some officers, those who worked late shifts on the avenue, had left chilling notes in the margins of reports. Felt watched, couldn't see anything, but it was there. I tried to share my concerns with my partner, but he brushed it off. "Don't go looking for ghosts," he said. But I couldn't stop. One night, my obsession nearly killed me. I was parked on the avenue, engine off, windows cracked. It was quiet, too quiet. Then, a sound, a faint hum, like static, but coming from nowhere. My skin prickled. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and looked around. That's when I saw the shimmer again. It was closer this time, less subtle. The air seemed to bend around it, distorting the empty street like a funhouse mirror. My gut screamed at me to get back in the car, but something about it was magnetic. Against all reason, I stepped closer. The shimmer moved. It was fast, darting down the street like a predator circling its prey. My flashlight flickered, then died. My gun felt useless in my holster. And then, I heard the whisper. "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was in my head, but louder than my thoughts. I stumbled back, the whisper growing into a deafening roar. Shapes began to form in the shimmer, elongated limbs, hollow eyes, twisted mouths that didn't belong on any living creature. They flickered in and out of existence, like they couldn't fully cross into our reality. I ran. Back in the car, I threw it into drive and sped off. My radio crackled, voices cutting in and out. "Officer down on Lincoln Avenue." The voice wasn't mine. When I reported the incident, I was met with silence. My captain gave me a long, hard look, then dismissed me for the night. 2 days later, I was called into his office. He handed me a file labeled Classified Tartarus Division. Inside were grainy stills from security footage, the woman I'd seen that night, the shimmer, and other images, faces contorted in terror, bodies suspended in midair, shadows that didn't belong to anything human. He said only one thing: "You didn't see anything." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I combed through the Tartarus file in secret. There were names of other officers, all with eerily similar accounts, all sworn to silence. A few had gone missing. That's when I found the recording. It was from a patrol car on Lincoln Avenue, time-stamped 5 years ago. The dash cam footage showed an empty street at first. Then, the shimmer appeared. The car's engine revved, but the officer never escaped. The shimmer enveloped the vehicle, and within seconds, the footage cut to static. The officer was never found. I requested a transfer the next day. Now, years later, I'm hundreds of miles away from Lincoln Avenue, but the whispers still haunt me. Sometimes when it's quiet, I'll hear the hum, faint but unmistakable. I've learned to ignore it. But if you ever find yourself driving down Lincoln Avenue late at night, and the air feels heavy, like it's pressing down on your chest, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. The first time I saw her was through the cracked screen of a police body cam. "Dispatch, suspect unarmed but acting erratic," the officer muttered as his footsteps echoed down the shadowed alley, his breath clouded in the frigid night air. Every exhale, a whisper of tension. The camera bobbed with his steps, capturing the shimmer of frost on the brick walls and the distant glow of streetlights. Then she appeared. She was crouched by a dumpster, her back to the officer, swaying ever so slightly like she was listening to music only she could hear. Her hair, long and dark, clung to her like seaweed on a corpse. The officer called out, his voice steady but sharp. "Ma'am, this is the police. Are you all right?" She didn't turn around. Instead, she raised a single hand, a pale skeletal thing with fingers too long, almost insect-like, and scratched the air. Slowly, methodically, like she was carving something unseen into the fabric of the night. "Ma'am," the officer repeated, more urgent now. He stepped closer, boots crunching on broken glass. That's when she moved. She didn't stand or turn around. She simply twisted. Her neck rotated far beyond what should have been possible, vertebrae cracking like dry twigs, until her face was staring back at the camera. Her eyes were enormous, hollow pits, swallowing the weak beam of the officer's flashlight. And her mouth, God, her mouth, stretched into a grin that could split a human skull. The body cam glitched. For a moment, the screen was static, the audio a shrill, grating scream. When the feed returned, the alley was empty. The woman was gone. "Officer Monroe, what's your status?" Dispatch buzzed, but Monroe wasn't responding. His body cam showed nothing but the open alley now, the flashlight beam trembling as it panned across damp brick walls. Then, with a wet, guttural crunch, the camera fell sideways. The last thing it captured before going dark was a streak of blood pooling into the frost. I shouldn't have seen that footage, but I did. And now she's found me. For 3 days after seeing that footage, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my apartment, every shadow caught in the corner of my eye felt alive, as if it carried the echo of her grin. Monroe's body was never found. The official report chalked it up to gang violence in the area, but I knew better. That thing, whatever it was, had taken him. I work in law enforcement too, just not on the front lines. My job was to review body cam footage for ongoing investigations, compiling evidence for court cases. After Monroe's footage, I told myself I'd misinterpreted what I saw. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a camera malfunction, or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But the night after I filed the footage, I got a message in my inbox. Unreviewed Incident 1127 code, redacted. It was flagged for immediate review, a case assigned to me, and only me. At first, I thought it was a mistake. No one spoke to me about it. No directives came through, just the video file. I shouldn't have clicked on it, but I did. This wasn't from Monroe's district. The footage came from across the city, 3 nights after his disappearance. It showed 2 officers responding to a break-in at a derelict industrial warehouse. Their body cams revealed the scene: rusted machines coated in dust, walls lined with graffiti, and corridors that seemed to stretch forever into the dark. "Anyone here? Show yourself," one officer barked, his flashlight slicing through the shadows. His partner covered his 6, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. And then they heard it. Laughter. It was faint at first, barely audible. A child's giggle. But as they moved deeper, it grew louder, distorted, the pitch warping until it sounded less like laughter and more like the twisted cries of something mocking human joy. "Cut the crap," the second officer shouted. "This is your last warning." The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness around them. That's when the flashlight beams caught movement. Something darted between the rusted machines, too fast to track. The officers shouted, raising their weapons, but it was no use. The thing emerged, not running, but crawling, limbs too long, joints bending the wrong way. It skittered toward them with impossible speed, its hollow eyes reflecting the light like mirrors. One officer fired. The gunshots echoed, deafening in the emptiness. The creature stopped, crouched on all 4s, and cocked its head. It didn't bleed. It didn't fall. It simply stared, grinning that same skull-splitting grin. Then it lunged. The camera feed erupted into chaos. Flashes of limbs, screams, static. The footage ended abruptly. I shut my laptop, heart pounding. My apartment felt suffocatingly quiet. Too quiet. And then I heard it. A faint scratching noise. At first I thought it was coming from the walls, maybe rats or the old pipes. But as I sat there frozen, I realized it wasn't the walls. It was my window. I turned slowly. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the silhouette behind them. Something tall, with fingers too long, was tracing patterns in the glass. Slowly, methodically. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, staring at that shadow. Minutes. Hours. Finally, I mustered the courage to reach for my phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911. 911? What's your emergency? "There's someone outside my window," I whispered. "Can you describe them?" The scratching stopped. The blinds fluttered, as if touched by a faint breeze. Then slowly, they began to part. "No," I stammered. No. Sir, are you there? Sir?" It was her. That face. That impossible grin. Her hollow eyes bore into mine as she pressed her palms flat against the glass. her nails scraping in a slow, deliberate rhythm. She leaned closer, her grin widening, until the corners of her mouth began to tear. I dropped the phone. I don't remember what happened next. One moment I was in my living room. The next I was sprinting down the fire escape, barefoot and half-dressed, into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest precinct, pounding on the doors like a lunatic. When they finally let me in, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but no one believed me. The footage from Monroe's body cam, gone. The unreviewed file, deleted from the system. They pulled up my personnel file and flagged me for mental health evaluation. I quit the next day. Now I'm writing this from a motel on the edge of town, lights blazing, a chair propped against the door. I don't think it'll matter. Wherever I go, she'll find me. If you're reading this and you work with police footage, take my advice. Don't click on anything marked redacted. And if you ever hear laughter in the dark, run. Don't look back, because no matter how fast you run, she'll be faster. It was just past midnight when my phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed restricted, but something about the timing felt off. I was home alone, sprawled on the couch with a half-empty beer and some late-night TV reruns. The sound of the phone ringing in the quiet room was like a scream. I hesitated but answered anyway. Hello? A voice, frantic and low, whispered, "Are you home? Lock your doors. Now." I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. "Who is this?" The line clicked dead. Normally I'd brush it off as a prank call or some weirdo, but the tone, that panicked edge, stuck with me. I stood up, every creak of the floor making me flinch, and went to the front door. It was already locked, but I double-checked. Windows, secure, back door, latched tight, satisfied. I sat back down, laughing nervously to myself. Then I saw the police cruiser pull into my driveway. The patrol car's lights weren't flashing, but its mere presence was enough to make my stomach churn. A tall officer stepped out, his silhouette sharp against the dim porch light. He knocked twice, and I debated for half a second whether to open it. "Mister?" His voice carried through the door. I answered cautiously, opening it just enough to meet his eyes. "Yeah? Something wrong?" "We received a report of suspicious activity in the area," he said. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but something in his eyes. It wasn't just concern. It was fear. "Have you seen or heard anything unusual tonight?" Well, I got a weird phone call a few minutes ago," I admitted. "Told me to lock my doors." The officer nodded, his hand resting lightly on his holstered gun. "May I come in?" Something in me screamed not to let him, but he was a cop. What else could I do? "Yeah, sure." As soon as he stepped in, I noticed the tension in his shoulders. He was scanning the room like he expected someone or something to leap out at any moment. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to mask my growing unease. He hesitated, then motioned toward the living room. "Can we sit? I'll explain everything." We sat. He didn't take off his hat, didn't relax. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and lowered his voice. "There's been an incident nearby. I need to ask. Have you noticed anything strange in the past week? People following you? Strange vehicles parked outside?" My heart skipped a beat. "No, nothing like that. What kind of incident are we talking about?" He glanced toward the window, then back at me. "A break-in. But it's more complicated than that. The suspect might still be in the area." I felt the weight of his words settle like a lead blanket. Before I could press for details, the police radio clipped to his shoulder crackled to life. "Unit 47, report. Suspect confirmed near Elm and 3rd. Proceed with caution. All units advised." The officer shot up, his hand immediately gripping his gun. "Stay here," he ordered. "Lock the door behind me. Don't answer for anyone but the police." And just like that, he was gone, the red and blue glow of his cruiser fading down the street. I locked the door as he instructed, but the silence that followed was unbearable. That's when I noticed something. The basement door. It was slightly ajar. I stared at the basement door, my pulse roaring in my ears. I was sure I had closed it earlier. Positive. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to call the officer back, but my phone sat uselessly on the coffee table. I wasn't even sure I could move. Then came the sound. A soft, deliberate creak, like someone shifting their weight on the wooden basement steps. I backed away instinctively, eyes locked on the gap where the door hung slightly open. The living room suddenly felt suffocating. Every shadow stretched longer, every sound amplified. I grabbed the nearest thing resembling a weapon, a heavy floor lamp, and inched closer to the door. "Hello?" My voice barely broke a whisper. Idiotic. As if I wanted a reply. The silence was deafening. Then came a slow, scraping noise, like metal dragging against the wall. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. "Look," I stammered. "I don't know who's down there, but the cops are already here. They're coming back any second." Nothing. And then, almost imperceptibly, I saw it. A flash of movement low to the ground, at the edge of the basement's shadows. I stepped back, holding the lamp like a bat, and shouted, "I'm armed. Come out now." The basement door slammed shut. Hard. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't have time to think. My brain screamed run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Then the floor lamp's light flickered and died, plunging the room into a thick, oppressive darkness. And that's when the doorknob started to turn. The logical part of my brain was gone, overtaken by pure primal fear. I bolted for the kitchen, skidding on the tile as I grabbed the biggest knife I could find. The house was silent again. But I knew I wasn't alone. I tried to force my trembling fingers to dial 911, but the phone buzzed with a new notification. A single text message: "Get out." The number was restricted. As if on cue, the basement door creaked open. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the stairs. I pressed myself against the far wall of the kitchen, knife in hand, when I saw him step into view. It wasn't the cop. The man was tall and wiry, his face obscured by some kind of crude mask, a burlap sack with slits for eyes. He held a crowbar in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against the wall as he stepped into the living room. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. "Come out now, and I'll make it quick." I froze, barely breathing, as he scanned the room. His head tilted, and he sniffed the air like a predator. Then he turned, heading for the hallway that led to the kitchen. I wasn't going to wait for him to find me. As soon as his back was turned, I bolted. I sprinted through the side door into the yard, knife still clutched in my hand. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran toward the street, praying the officer's cruiser would still be close. Instead, I saw two figures standing in the shadows near the curb. "Help!" I screamed, desperate, running toward them. They stepped into the light. It was the officer. But standing next to him was another man, wearing a matching police uniform. Same height, same build, same badge. My brain struggled to process it, and before I could stop myself, I blurted, "What?" The officer I'd let into my house earlier raised his gun. "On the ground, now." I didn't move. Couldn't. The other officer, the real one, looked just as confused as I felt. He put a hand on his holster, his expression sharp. "What's going on here?" The man with the gun didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the house, and for a fraction of a second, I saw it. The tiniest shift in his demeanor. Panic. He wasn't a cop. "Drop the gun," the second officer barked, stepping forward. And then, chaos. The fake cop turned and bolted, disappearing into the dark. The real officer chased him, shouting into his radio for backup. I stood there trembling, clutching my knife, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Behind me, from the open basement door, came a low, guttural laugh. I didn't wait. I ran. The real police arrived minutes later. They searched the house, the basement, the yard, but whoever or whatever had been there was gone. No fingerprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. The officer who'd chased the imposter returned, his face pale. He told me the man had vanished into the woods, leaving behind a discarded mask and the empty shell of a police cruiser. "That guy in your house?" the officer said, his voice grave. "He's been posing as law enforcement for months, breaking in, stalking people. You're lucky to be alive." Lucky. That word stuck with me. I moved out of that house the next day, left the city altogether. But every night I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the creak of the basement stairs. And sometimes, when my phone buzzes in the dark, I still see those words. Get out. I didn't believe the warnings at first. I mean, who listens to whispers about a desolate highway anyway? But this wasn't just any road. It was Ridgeway Stretch, a winding path through the middle of nowhere. My night shift had just ended, and my brain was buzzing too much for a straight route home. Something about the idea of open roads under a pitch-black sky seemed soothing. I should have stayed on the main road. It started harmless enough. The hum of my car, the faint rhythm of late-night radio, and the vast emptiness stretching ahead. But something felt off. The moon, which had been full and bright, vanished behind clouds, plunging the world into a darkness so thick my headlights barely made a dent. Then I saw it. A figure on the side of the road, just standing there. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. They didn't wave, didn't move, just stood still like they were carved out of the darkness itself. Something about the way they leaned slightly forward felt wrong, like gravity was holding them in place unnaturally. My instinct screamed, "Keep driving." So I did. But as my car rolled past, the headlights flickered, and I swear I saw the figure twist its head to watch me. Only there were no eyes, just hollow pits. My chest tightened, and I floored the gas pedal. The car roared forward, the speedometer climbing past 70, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The road felt endless, curving in ways it hadn't before, twisting like a serpent. My GPS blinked out, replacing my destination with static. That's when the radio crackled to life. A voice, low and distorted, seeped through the speakers. "You shouldn't have ignored me." I nearly swerved off the road as the voice hissed through the car's speakers. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it was rattling my ribs. The radio wasn't even turned on. I'd switched it off minutes ago, fed up with static. But here it was, alive and taunting me. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Long shift, dark road, adrenaline. Classic ingredients for a good scare. That's all it was. At least, that's what I told myself until my headlights caught movement up ahead. Something darted across the road, low and fast, like an animal. I slammed the brakes hard, skidding to a stop. The silence afterward was deafening. My car idled in the middle of the stretch, headlights illuminating nothing but empty asphalt and the distant shimmer of mist. Then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from above. I froze, staring at the roof of the car. The tapping grew louder, sharper, like nails scratching at metal. My breath hitched as I glanced at the rearview mirror. The interior was pitch black, but for a moment, I thought I saw movement behind me. A subtle shift of a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Gripping the wheel tighter, I slammed the car into gear and sped off. The tapping stopped instantly, but the relief didn't last. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. Look in the mirror. I didn't want to. God help me, I didn't want to. But my eyes betrayed me, flickering up to the rear view. The shadow was back, but now it had form. A figure hunched low, its head almost brushing the roof. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel it staring at me, the weight of its presence pressing down on my chest. No, I whispered, shaking my head, as if denying it could make it disappear. My foot pressed harder on the gas. The engine whined, the car shuddering as it hit 90, then 100. The road narrowed, trees closing in like a tunnel, their branches clawing at the sides of my car. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, its presence growing heavier with each passing second. Then, in a voice that sounded like rusted metal scraping glass, it whispered, "You can't outrun it." I screamed, swerving wildly. The car clipped something, a signpost or maybe a guardrail, and spun out. Time slowed as the world flipped. Metal groaned, glass shattered, and for a horrifying moment, I thought I was going to die. But I didn't. When the car finally stopped rolling, I was upside down, hanging by the seatbelt. Blood dripped from a gash on my forehead, my breaths shallow and rapid. The silence was suffocating. I fumbled with the buckle, crashing down onto the cracked windshield. Every muscle in my body screamed as I crawled out of the wreckage. The night was eerily calm. My car lay in a mangled heap, steam hissing from the engine. The road was gone. I wasn't on Ridgway Stretch anymore. I wasn't anywhere. Around me was an endless expanse of fog, shifting like it was alive. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate, growing closer. I turned, my legs trembling, and saw the figure emerge from the mist. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. "What do you want?" I screamed, backing away. It didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with a hand that wasn't a hand. It was more like a claw, made of shadows. And then, it spoke. "You left the road. Now you belong to me." I woke up in my bed, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The clock read 7:06 a.m. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, warm and familiar. It was just a nightmare, a terrible, vivid nightmare. But as I sat up, my body aching, I realized something was wrong. The clothes I was wearing were the same ones from the night before, torn and stained with blood. My car keys were still in my pocket, sticky with grime, and etched into the palm of my hand, as if burned there, were 3 words: "Don't come back." I haven't driven at night since, and if you're ever tempted to take Ridgway Stretch for a shortcut, let me save you the trouble. Whatever's out there, it doesn't like visitors. The highway was empty, except for my old sedan cutting through the cold, humid night. The yellow lines on the asphalt blurred as I sped up, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. Every so often, my headlights would catch the silhouette of a road sign or an old skeletal tree, their shadows stretching and shrinking across the cracked pavement. I shouldn't have taken that detour. It started as a routine trip home. Work had bled into the late hours, and I'd left the office with nothing on my mind but getting back to bed. The regular route was closed, some roadwork or an accident. I didn't pay attention. My GPS offered an alternative, a back road that wound through what looked like endless farmland and forest. At first, the dark quiet was soothing, almost peaceful. But then I noticed something unsettling. A shape in the rearview mirror. A light. Faint at first, blinking intermittently far behind me. I slowed down, expecting it to vanish like a trick of the eye, but it didn't. It grew stronger, steadier. A single glaring white orb, bouncing over the road, speeding closer. At the next intersection, I turned off without hesitation, tires screeching against the asphalt. The road narrowed, trees crowding in on either side, and the light disappeared. I let out a shaky breath. Probably just another driver, I told myself. A farmer or a trucker, out late. That's when the radio crackled. It was off. I was sure of it. Off and silent, like it had been all night. But now it hissed, faint voices slipping in and out of static. I glanced at the dashboard, confused, and almost didn't notice the figure in the road until it was too late. It appeared so suddenly, my chest tightened. A man stood directly in my path, his hand raised like he was signaling me to stop. I slammed the brakes, my car screeching to a halt. Heart pounding, I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. The man was pale, unnaturally so, his face hollow and his clothes rumpled. He didn't look homeless, though, or drunk, more like something misplaced. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear him. My gut told me to drive, but curiosity won. I cracked the window. "What are you doing out here?" I called, my voice shaking more than I liked. The man's lips stopped moving, his head tilted, neck bending in an unnatural angle. Then, in a voice as clear as if he were sitting beside me, he whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." Every instinct screamed to press the gas and go, but my body froze. It wasn't just fear. It was something heavier, like the air had thickened, rooting me to the spot. Then the man moved, not toward me, backward. His feet shuffled awkwardly as he retreated into the shadows, his figure melting into the trees. The radio hissed louder now, the static broken by faint guttural sounds that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Before I could act, the light reappeared in my rearview mirror. This time it wasn't distant. It flooded the inside of my car, so bright it washed out the world outside. My foot found the pedal, and I sped off, the light chasing me like a predator. I floored the gas pedal, the old sedan groaning as it sped down the winding road. The blinding light in my rearview mirror didn't falter. It grew brighter, closer, swallowing the world behind me. My hands gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles ached, and the forest on either side blurred into an endless wall of black. The radio screamed now. No music, just static and garbled voices, as if 100 people were shouting underwater. The sound clawed at my brain, making it hard to think. I reached for the dial, desperate to shut it off, but it wouldn't budge. A figure appeared ahead, standing in the middle of the road again. It wasn't the man from before. It was taller, thinner, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head lolled to the side as if it couldn't hold it up. And its eyes. God, its eyes glowed the same blinding white as the light behind me. I yanked the wheel to the left, narrowly avoiding it, and felt the car's tires hit gravel. My heart stopped as the vehicle skidded, the steering wheel jerking out of my hands. I was certain I'd crash into a tree, but the car swerved back onto the road as if pulled by an invisible force. That was when I heard the laughter. It wasn't from the radio or the road. It came from inside the car. I didn't dare look around. My eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, where the forest began to thin, revealing a stretch of open field. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, echoing in my ears. I couldn't tell if it was mocking or joyous. but it chilled me to my core. "Keep driving," a voice whispered from the passenger seat. I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over. The passenger seat was empty, but for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to shift, forming a faint outline of a figure hunched over, watching me. Its face was obscured, but its presence pressed on me like a physical weight. The light in the rearview mirror was gone now, but I didn't dare slow down. My car roared across the field, the tires thumping over uneven ground. The open space should have felt like relief, but the darkness here was heavier, more oppressive. It swallowed the stars and the moon, leaving only my dim headlights cutting through the void. Then my engine sputtered. "No, no, no," I muttered, slamming my foot on the pedal. The car jerked forward but lost speed, its protests growing louder with each passing second. Finally, it rolled to a stop, the engine clicking as it died. The headlights flickered, then went out, leaving me in absolute darkness. For a long moment, there was silence, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the dirt behind me. My breath hitched, my entire body trembling. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to turn on its flashlight, but it slipped from my hands and fell somewhere under the seat. The footsteps stopped. A faint glow appeared in the distance, the same orb of light I'd seen earlier. It hovered, pulsating like a heartbeat, and slowly began to move toward me. I scrambled out of the car, my legs weak, my body screaming to run, but unable to obey. The orb floated closer, illuminating the field in its eerie, shifting glow. And then I saw them. Figures stood all around me, their outlines faint and flickering, like static on an old TV. They were just outside the orb's reach, encircling me. Their faces were blank, no features, no eyes, just smooth, pale surfaces that tilted toward me as if watching. The orb stopped a few feet away, hovering in the air. I stared at it, mesmerized, as it began to change. Its light dimmed, revealing a swirling, gas-like surface that twisted and turned. The figures stepped closer, their movements jerky, unnatural. I forced myself to move, stumbling backward. My hand brushed against something cold and metal. The car's door. Without thinking, I climbed back inside and locked the doors, as if that could protect me. The orb didn't follow. Instead, it began to stretch and shift, forming a long, thin shape that resembled an arm. The limb extended toward the car, its fingers tapping gently on the windshield. Tap, tap, tap. The radio crackled to life again, this time with a single clear voice. "Run." The orb exploded in a blinding flash of light, and I screamed, shielding my eyes. When I dared to look again, the figures were gone. The field was empty, silent, except for the faint hum of my engine sputtering back to life. I didn't question it. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, not caring where the road led, as long as it was away. The orb's glow lingered in my rearview mirror for miles, like a distant star, before finally fading into the night. I made it home just before dawn, my hands still trembling as I shut the door behind me. Sleep didn't come that morning, or the next night. I still see the orb sometimes, in the corner of my vision, when I'm driving alone, and I never ever take the back roads anymore. It's a quiet November night, and you're driving along a winding country road, the kind that feels endless, flanked by skeletal trees clawing at the dark sky. The kind of night where even the stars seem to shy away, leaving you under a dome of oppressive blackness. Your high beams carve a narrow path ahead, illuminating only the cold asphalt and the occasional reflector post. You weren't supposed to take this road, but the GPS rerouted you due to an accident on the interstate, and now you're here, on this godforsaken road, miles from anywhere. And then you see it, a figure, It's standing at the edge of the road, barely illuminated by your headlights. Instinctively, your foot eases off the accelerator. They're not waving you down, not signaling for help. They're just standing there, facing the road, facing you. Your brain tries to rationalize it. Maybe it's a stranded motorist, a jogger. But why here? Why now? The figure doesn't move. It's when you draw closer that the dread sets in. They're dressed in a coat far too light for the weather, their head hanging at an angle that makes your neck hurt just looking at it. You squint, heart hammering. Their face is obscured, shadowed, or maybe featureless. Your gut screams at you to keep driving. Just keep going. Don't stop. But something, some damnable magnetic pull, makes you slow down. You stop the car about 20 feet away. The figure doesn't react. It's as if they don't notice your car or don't care. You flick on your brights, flooding the road with light, and they're gone. No, not gone. Moved. You see them now, but they're off the road, deeper into the trees, standing just at the edge of the beam's reach, still as a statue watching. You don't know why, but you roll down the window just a crack. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's that human instinct to do the worst possible thing in a dangerous situation. Your voice feels small in the yawning silence. Hey, you need help? No response. The figure doesn't move, but the trees behind them sway slightly in the wind, or at least you think it's the wind. It's hard to tell because you hear nothing. No rustle of leaves, no distant hum of crickets, just the engine's low growl and your own breathing, sharp and uneven. You start to second-guess yourself. Maybe you imagined them moving off the road. Maybe your tired brain is playing tricks. But then your headlights flicker. Not off, not entirely, but enough to make your stomach drop. The beams dim for a split second, and when they come back, the figure is closer. Much closer. They're at the edge of the ditch now, their face, or the void where their face should be, angled directly at you. Your chest tightens as you realize you can't make out any features, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth expanse of pale skin. And then you notice something else. Their hands. Long, wrong. Like talons, hanging just a little too low, the fingers unnaturally thin and curling slightly, as if they're waiting to grasp something. Your survival instincts kick in. You slam the window shut and put the car in gear. You're not staying here. Not tonight. Not for anyone or anything. The tires screech as you take off, but as the car lurches forward, you feel a weight, a pressure, like someone's holding the back of the car, the rear view mirror. You know you shouldn't look, but your eyes dart to it anyway, and they're there, perched on the trunk, their hands splayed out against the glass, fingers stretching impossibly long. They're still featureless, but you swear you can feel them looking at you, through you. You scream and stomp the gas. The car roars, the tires find grip, and for a second, you think you're free. The figure slides off the back, disappearing into the dark road behind you. Relief washes over you in a cold wave, but then something taps the window. Once, twice, a rhythmic knock, deliberate and unhurried. It's coming from the passenger side. You whip your head around. The figure is sitting in the seat beside you, impossibly calm, hands resting on their knees like they've been there the whole time. The inside of the car reeks now, like wet earth and decay. You don't even think. You wrench the wheel to the side. The car fishtails, and you barely manage to keep it from rolling as it screeches to a halt in the middle of the road. You throw open the door and bolt into the woods, leaving the car behind. Branches slash at your arms and face as you run. You don't know where you're going, but anywhere is better than here. The figure doesn't chase you, at least not in the way you expect. You can't see them, but you feel them. Their presence is heavy, like the air is pressing down on you. Every shadow seems alive, every sound amplified. Finally, you burst into a clearing and collapse to your knees. The moonlight bathes the open space, giving you the first sense of security you've felt all night. You take a moment to catch your breath, the cold seeping into your skin as you sit there trembling, and then you hear it. The knock. Once, twice. You whip around, and there, at the edge of the clearing, the figure stands. Only now, they're not alone. Dozens of them emerge from the trees, identical and featureless, their long fingers curling and uncurling as they close in. They form a perfect circle around you, their movements synchronized, their heads tilting in unison. Your scream catches in your throat as they close the gap, their smooth faces mere inches from yours. And then, blackness. When you wake up, you're in your car. It's parked neatly at the gas station you stopped at before this nightmare began. The sun is rising, the orange glow spilling over the horizon. The engine is off, your keys in your lap. Everything looks normal, except for the muddy handprint smeared across your windshield. It started with a buzzing fluorescent light overhead, one of those that flicker in just the wrong rhythm to dig under your skin. I was midway through another night shift at the 24-hour gas station, just off Route 17. You know the kind, reeking of old coffee, shelves lined with stale chips, and the perpetual hum of the ice cream freezer. That night, a fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen, swallowing up the world outside. The highway was nothing but black asphalt disappearing into a wall of gray. I hated working these shifts alone, but we'd just lost our only other night clerk. Guess it was my turn to hold down the fort until corporate hired someone new. It wasn't long before the first weird thing happened. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it. A faint tapping, like fingernails drumming against glass. It came from the front window. At first, I thought it was just some bug drawn to the neon open sign, but the sound was deliberate, methodical. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced up from the register, squinting through the fog-drenched pane. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow move. Hello? My voice cracked, embarrassing me even in my solitude. No answer. Steeling myself, I stepped out from behind the counter and moved closer to the glass. My breath fogged up the pane as I leaned in, searching for movement. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A hand. Pale, long fingers, almost skeletal, reached up and pressed against the outside of the glass. My heart leapt into my throat. I stumbled back, knocking over a rack of potato chips. The hand was gone. I fumbled for the phone, but of course, the damn landline had been out for days. Cell service out here? Forget it. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I convinced myself it was a prank. Some drunk weirdo messing around. But deep down, I knew better. I sat back behind the counter, trying to focus on restocking cigarettes and lottery tickets. For a while, it was quiet again, save for the buzz of that stupid light. Then the power flickered, plunging the store into a brief, suffocating darkness. When the light snapped back on, something wasn't right. One of the aisles, the one with the cheap candy, had been knocked over. Candy bars scattered across the floor. No way had that been like that before. I grabbed the flashlight we kept under the counter and stepped into the aisle. My palms were slick with sweat. "Is someone here?" I called out. My voice echoed against the empty shelves. No answer. Then, the freezer door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my hand. The freezer doors gleamed under the flickering light, their surfaces coated with condensation. Slowly, I moved toward them, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air seemed colder than it should have been, like the chill from the freezers had leaked into the entire store. My breath puffed out in short, nervous clouds. And then I saw it. One of the glass doors had fogged over, and written in the condensation, in long, jagged letters, were the words, "Look behind you." I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end. My throat felt tight, like something invisible was wrapping around it. I didn't want to turn. Every cell in my body screamed, "Don't turn around." But I did. The flashlight beam swept over the empty aisles, shaking as I scanned for anything out of place. There was nothing, just shelves of junk food and energy drinks. The fogged-up window near the entrance. The door I swore I had locked earlier, now standing slightly ajar. A tendril of fog, curling in like a lazy, creeping snake. And then, movement. At the edge of the beam, something darted between the shelves, not walking, crawling. I backed up toward the counter, flashlight shaking. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. It appeared then, just for a second, peeking out from the corner of the pet food aisle. A face. But it wasn't a face. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched unnaturally tight over bone. The thing leaned out farther, its head cocking to one side like it was studying me. Then it scuttled out of sight, faster than anything human should move. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted toward the front door, slamming into the glass, fumbling with the lock. My fingers felt clumsy, the cold making them numb. Behind me, I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it was everywhere. From the freezer doors, the windows, even the ceiling. Tap, tap, tap. The door finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the fog. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop running. The gas pumps were barely visible through the haze, their lights dim and flickering. That's when I heard the voice. "Where are you going?" It came from all directions, deep and rasping, like someone trying to talk through a throat full of gravel. I turned, flashlight beam slicing through the fog, and saw them. Dozens of them. Figures, crawling on all fours, their faceless heads tilted unnaturally. Their pale bodies seemed to shimmer, half solid, like they were caught between this world and another. They were closing in, surrounding me. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran for my car. The keys were in my pocket, but my hands were shaking so badly, it felt like it took an eternity to pull them out. The flashlight slipped from my grip and rolled away, its beam casting eerie shadows as it spun. I finally got the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and oppressive, and the creatures were there, circling the car. Their hands scraped against the glass, leaving smears of condensation behind. I turned the key in the ignition, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward me in unison. For a moment, everything was silent. Then they screamed. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, high-pitched, guttural, like 1,000 voices crying out in agony. They lunged at the car, their hands slamming against the windows, their bodies writhing and twisting in impossible ways. I floored it. The tires squealed as I shot forward, the creatures scattering in the headlights. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove through the fog, the empty highway stretching out before me like a lifeline. Eventually, the fog lifted. The gas station disappeared in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. I quit the next day. I still don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear it. The tapping. And I can't help but wonder if they ever really let me go. The diner where I worked night shifts wasn't anything special. just a run-of-the-mill greasy spoon sitting off a desolate highway in the middle of nowhere. Most nights were uneventful, serving truckers, wiping counters, and flipping through an ancient magazine to pass the hours. But that night was different. It started when the clock on the wall chimed midnight, a ritual so mundane that I usually didn't notice it. This time, though, the sound stretched on longer than it should have, like the chime was being dragged, distorted, pulled apart. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed and flickered, sending the room into brief bursts of darkness. I glanced toward the door, half hoping to see a customer walk in and break the eerie silence. Instead, the night outside seemed thicker than usual, the parking lot lights barely piercing the foggy darkness. Then the bell above the door jingled. No one had walked in. That's when I noticed the booth at the far end of the diner. It was occupied. I hadn't heard anyone come in. The man sitting there had his back to me. He wore a black jacket, the kind with a hood, though it was down. His dark hair was greasy and matted, and he sat perfectly still, staring out the window into the nothingness beyond. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't turn around. Great. Another weirdo. I grabbed the coffee pot and walked over, the sound of my sneakers sticking to the linoleum, filling the oppressive silence. "Coffee?" He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were glassy, unblinking. "Do you ever wonder," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "what's watching when you're alone?" I froze, coffee pot trembling in my hand. What?" His lips curled into a grin, not a friendly one. Before I could respond, the lights in the diner flickered again. The man's grin widened, and when the lights steadied, the booth was empty. My stomach dropped. The coffee pot slipped from my fingers, shattering on the floor. And then, I heard it. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the kitchen. I stood frozen, staring at the shards of glass and the growing puddle of coffee at my feet. The tapping continued, echoing from the kitchen in the back. Each sound felt deliberate, as if whatever was making it wanted me to know it was there. My mind raced through rational explanations. Maybe it was a raccoon that got in through the back door. Maybe it was just the pipes. Maybe I was imagining things, but none of those thoughts made my legs stop trembling. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The diner was dead silent now, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and that god-awful tapping. I knew I had to check. As much as I wanted to grab my keys and bolt for my car, my feet betrayed me. I stepped cautiously toward the kitchen, every squeak of my sneakers against the linoleum, sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. The door to the kitchen was ajar, swinging slightly as if it had just been pushed open. The fluorescent light above it flickered erratically. "Anyone there?" I asked, louder this time. The tapping stopped. My breath hitched, and I clenched my fists to keep them from shaking. I stepped through the door and scanned the room. Everything was where it should be. The counters, the griddle, the industrial sink, nothing out of place. Until I saw the freezer door. It was cracked open. I knew I'd closed it. I was sure of it. The freezer was old, and it didn't stay cool unless it was properly latched. I edged closer, feeling the cold air snake out and brush against my skin. The tapping resumed, louder now, and it was definitely coming from inside the freezer. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle. Slowly, I pulled it open. The smell hit me first, metallic, rancid, and suffocating. Inside, the shelves were empty, save for a single object on the middle rack. It was a jar. The glass was smeared with something dark and viscous, and inside a mass of something pulsed faintly, as though alive. My stomach churned, but before I could back away, I heard a voice. "I told you," it whispered, low and guttural. I spun around, and there he was, the man from the booth, now standing in the doorway of the kitchen. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, and his grin was stretched wider than before, exposing teeth that were jagged and wrong. "You ever wonder what's watching?" he hissed, his voice distorted, like static on an old TV. I stumbled back, my foot slipping on the slick freezer floor. The jar fell from the shelf, shattering on the ground. The thing inside spilled out, a writhing, fleshy mass that began to grow. It unfurled long, spindly limbs that slapped against the walls, its surface glistening with a black, tar-like substance. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, as the creature turned toward me, its eyeless face twisted and shifted, its mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. "Run," the man said, his voice almost gleeful. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out of the kitchen, through the diner, and into the foggy night. My car was the only thing I could think of, my sanctuary from whatever nightmare was unfolding behind me. As I reached the parking lot, I glanced back at the diner. The windows were dark, but I could see movement inside, shadows slithering across the walls, something too large to fit in that tiny kitchen. I jumped into my car, fumbled with the keys, and finally got the engine roaring. Tires screeching, I tore out of the lot, leaving the diner and its horrors behind. But as I sped down the empty highway, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the road, his grin still stretched wide, his hand raised in a slow, mocking wave. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quit the diner the next day, but some nights, when the world is too quiet, I swear I can still hear the tapping. It started like any other night shift. The fluorescent lights in the back room of the gas station flickered with their usual irritating hum. I'd taken this job for the quiet. Somewhere I could collect my thoughts while dealing with the odd customer or two, mostly truckers and night owls. I'd been working there for 6 months without incident. That night, though, was different. It was the dead of winter, and a brutal windstorm had turned the streets into a graveyard of fallen branches and trash. I leaned against the counter, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, when the door chimed. A man walked in. His face was shrouded in the shadow of a hoodie, and he moved deliberately, too deliberate for someone who just wanted chips or smokes. Something about him immediately set my nerves on edge. He didn't look at me, didn't grab anything. He just wandered the aisles like he was searching for something. The cameras buzzed overhead. I glanced up at the monitors above the counter. I'd grown used to watching people on those screens. Most were harmless, predictable. But as I scanned the feeds, my stomach turned. There was a glitch in the camera. A second figure flickered into view behind the man. Tall, thin, its limbs too long for its body. Its head tilted unnaturally as it watched him. I blinked hard, thinking it was a software issue. But when I looked back up, the figure was gone. The man finally approached the counter, dropping a pack of gum and a small black notebook onto the surface. I rang him up, barely able to meet his eyes. "You working alone tonight?" he asked. It was a simple question, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. His voice was low, grating, like the sound of gravel under tires. "Yeah," I replied, regretting it instantly. He grinned, revealing teeth that were uneven and stained. He paid in cash, shoved the change into his pocket, and left without another word. But as the door swung shut, I noticed something he'd left behind. The notebook. It was small and weathered, its cover marked with a symbol I didn't recognize. My gut told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open. The pages were filled with numbers, rows and rows of handwritten code that made no sense to me. Then, at the bottom of one page, I saw something that made my breath hitch. Do not stay until 3:17 a.m. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:48. For the next 29 minutes, I tried to shake it off as some kind of prank. But as the hour approached, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, longer than usual. The cameras in the corner started to glitch again, showing static interspersed with brief, distorted images of the store. And then there were the noises, soft, guttural whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At 3:16, the power went out completely. The store plunged into darkness, save for the faint blinking glow of the exit sign. And then the door chimed again. The chime echoed unnaturally in the silent store. My stomach knotted as the air around me turned cold, like I'd stepped into a meat locker. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to scan the darkness. The aisles stretched out like corridors to nowhere, and the shadows seemed to writhe at the edges of the beam. Hello? My voice sounded small, trembling. No answer. The chime came again. The door hadn't opened. It was still shut, but the sound repeated over and over, like someone was walking in and out, or something was toying with me. Then a sound from the back room, a dragging noise, heavy and wet, like a sack of meat being pulled across the floor. My body froze, my breathing shallow. The noise stopped, replaced by a faint clicking sound, like fingernails tapping glass. I slowly aimed my flashlight toward the office door. It creaked open, just a crack, revealing only darkness within. "Who's there?" I whispered, barely audible even to myself. A voice answered, low and distorted. "You should have left." I nearly dropped my phone. The voice came from everywhere, above me, behind me, inside me. I took a step back, my heel catching the edge of the counter. That's when I saw it on the cameras. The monitors, somehow still active despite the power outage, showed the store from every angle, and in every feed, it was there. The thing I'd seen earlier, flickering like a broken signal. It stood impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling. Its body was grotesquely elongated, with limbs that bent in ways no humans should. Its face was nothing but a void, darker than the surrounding shadows. It moved slowly down the aisle, its steps silent but deliberate, coming straight toward me. I spun around, shining my light. Nothing was there. Yet on the cameras, it was only feet away. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the back door. The dragging sound started again, louder now, as if it were right behind me. I reached the door and shoved it open, stumbling into the freezing night air. The parking lot was empty, the wind howling through the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Fumbling with the keys, I started the engine and peeled out of the lot. The rear-view mirror taunted me. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, terrified of what I might see. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in my living room, shaking. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from an unknown number. "You forgot the notebook." My blood ran cold. I didn't respond, didn't sleep, didn't even move for the rest of the night. When morning came, I called my manager and quit. I never went back to that gas station. Weeks later, I saw a news report. A night shift worker at the same gas station had gone missing. The police found the store in disarray, the back room smeared with streaks of something unidentifiable. They never found the worker, or any evidence of who, or what, had been there. I've kept the story to myself all these years, but every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. That chime. And I know it hasn't forgotten me. The evening air was thick with the smell of wet hay and the faint metallic tang of old tools. The wind carried a strange, almost melodic whistling sound that seemed to rise and fall, as if it was alive and moving just beyond the edge of the cornfield. That's where I was, alone on my grandfather's farm for the weekend. He'd left a list of chores, but I was mostly there to keep an eye on the livestock. Easy enough. It started with the chickens. Around midnight, I heard them squawking, not their usual restless chatter, but a frenzied, chaotic scream that shot me bolt upright in bed. Grabbing the flashlight by the door, I shoved my feet into my boots and headed out. The barnyard was quiet, except for the frantic rustling inside the coop. When I opened the door, my stomach twisted. Something had ripped through the chicken wire, leaving a gaping hole. Feathers floated in the air like soft snow, and the floor was littered with streaks of blood. There were no tracks outside, just the hole and the silence. Too much silence. Even the frogs in the pond weren't croaking. I convinced myself it was a fox or maybe a coyote, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. By 2 a.m., the rain started, a steady, cold drizzle. I was lying in bed, staring at the wooden beams above me, when the faint sound of movement reached my ears. It wasn't coming from the house, but from somewhere outside. It was a low, dragging sound, punctuated by wet thuds, as if something heavy was being pulled through the mud. I hesitated for too long before grabbing the shotgun from the rack. As I stepped outside, the rain soaked me instantly, plastering my shirt to my skin. The sound was louder now. It was coming from the silo. The old wooden structure loomed ahead, its weathered planks dark against the stormy sky. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the rain, knocking loose a tarp. But as I approached, the dragging sound stopped. I swung the flashlight beam towards the base of the silo. That's when I saw it. A figure was hunched over the pile of spilled corn, its arms long and bony, the skin stretched tight over sharp joints. Its back was to me, but its movements were jerky and wrong, like a puppet with tangled strings. I froze, the beam of light shaking as my hands trembled. Whatever it was, it turned its head slowly, unnaturally far, until its face was visible in profile. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth impossibly wide, filled with rows of teeth that looked more like shards of broken glass. It grinned, a thin, split-lipped smile that made my knees buckle. And then it stood. It was tall, too tall. It had to duck as it turned fully towards me. In its clawed hand, it held a chicken, what was left of one. It dropped the carcass, and the wet thud echoed in the silence. The thing started towards me, its movements fluid now, almost hypnotic. I ran. The mud sucked at my boots as I sprinted back to the house. I didn't dare look back, not even when I heard the wet slapping of its footsteps gaining on me. By the time I reached the door, I was screaming. I slammed it shut, bolting the lock and shoving the kitchen table against it for good measure. The footsteps stopped just outside. The porch creaked as it stepped up, and I could hear it sniffing, the sound wet and guttural. Then, nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, the shotgun cradled in my arms, the flashlight trained on the door. It didn't return. Not that night. But the farm wasn't the same after that. Strange things kept happening. The cows refused to graze near the silo, and I found deep clawed marks gouged into the barn doors. And every night, without fail, that melodic whistling would drift through the air, growing louder as it approached the house. I left that farm the next morning, my chores undone. I never told my grandfather what happened. I didn't have to. When he called me weeks later, His voice was shaking. He said something was out there, something that didn't belong. He never saw it, but he heard the whistling. He sold the farm not long after that. Last I heard, the new owners abandoned it after their son disappeared. They said he was playing near the silo. I know better. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I left the farm and the horrors stayed there, tied to the land like a bad dream. But things like that don't let go so easily. They follow you. They linger. A few months after I left, I moved to the city, hoping the crowded streets and constant hum of life would drown out the memories. It worked for a while. I even started sleeping better, the image of that grinning, hollow-eyed thing fading with time. Then, one night, I heard it again. I was walking home late, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The streets were empty, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural in a city. I'd just turned a corner when I heard it. The whistling, that same melodic tune, the one I had convinced myself was just the wind back on the farm. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was faint, almost playful, coming from somewhere up ahead. Slowly, I turned my head. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows. For a moment, I saw nothing, just empty sidewalks and parked cars. Then, it stepped into the light. It was the same as before, tall, gangly, its skin stretched taut over bones that seemed to shift and crack as it moved. Its eyes locked on mine, black and endless, and it smiled that impossible smile. But now, it was wearing something. A tattered flannel shirt and overalls, smeared with mud and blood, as if mocking the life I'd tried to leave behind. It tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. And then, it began to move. Not running, not lunging, but walking, slow and deliberate, each step a taunt. I did the only thing I could. I ran. The streets blurred as I sprinted, my lungs burning with each gasp of icy air. The whistling followed, growing louder, closer, no matter how fast I ran. I turned corner after corner, desperately searching for someone, anyone. But the city seemed empty, like the world had folded in on itself, leaving me alone with that thing. Finally, I spotted an old church, its heavy oak doors slightly ajar. I dove inside, slamming the door shut and sliding the iron bolt into place. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped. Then the whistling started again, just outside the door. It circled the building, the sound rising and falling as it moved, always just out of sight. I backed away, clutching a heavy candlestick I'd grabbed from the altar. My eyes darted to the stained glass windows, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I noticed the shadow. It stretched across the floor, long and spindly, growing larger as it moved closer to the window. Slowly, its face came into view, distorted by the colored glass, but unmistakable. It pressed a hand, if you could call it that, against the window, the claws clicking softly against the pane. And then, it smiled. I don't know what happened next. Maybe I screamed. Maybe I passed out. All I know is that when I woke up, the church was empty, the doors still bolted, and the whistling was gone. But it left something behind. On the floor, in the faint light filtering through the stained glass, was a single feather, blood-stained and torn, just like the ones from the coop on the farm. I moved again after that, farther this time. Different city, different state, but no matter where I go, I hear it sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, that faint, mocking tune, carried on a wind that doesn't belong. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I know this: It's still out there, somewhere, and it's still watching. So, if you're ever out in the countryside and you hear whistling, don't follow it. Don't look for the source. Just run and pray it isn't looking for you. It started with a bet. I was bored, drunk, and feeling invincible when I said I'd spend the night out at Widow's Creek Farm. For years, it had been the town's favorite spooky story, the abandoned farmhouse, where people swore they heard voices, saw shadows moving in the windows. Local legend said the owner, Mr. Eldridge, vanished one night, and no one had been able to buy or sell the property since. Something about the land made people uneasy, but I didn't believe in all that. Armed with a flashlight, a folding chair, and a thermos of coffee, I set out to prove everyone wrong. By the time I got to the farm, the moon was low and hazy, casting just enough light to turn the barn and house into black, jagged silhouettes against the night sky. I parked the truck at the edge of the property and made my way to the porch. The wood groaned beneath my weight, the sound echoing in the absolute stillness. Inside, the house smelled like wet rot. My flashlight beam swept over faded wallpaper and furniture covered in sheets. But what struck me was the silence. No crickets, no wind, just nothing. Easy, I muttered to myself, setting up my chair in the front room where I had a clear view of the kitchen and stairs. Just a night alone in an old house. The first few hours passed without incident. I tried to stream music, but the signal was dead. That's when I heard it, a faint thud upstairs. My flashlight shot toward the staircase, catching nothing but empty steps. It's just the house settling, I told myself, though my pulse was already quickening. And then, the lantern flickered to life. It was sitting on the kitchen table, a rusty oil lantern I hadn't noticed before. A weak yellow flame danced inside, casting moving shadows on the walls. I froze. There was no one here. No one could have lit it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The lantern flame sputtered as if in response, then settled into a steady glow. I stepped closer, my boots dragging against the warped floorboards. The lantern's glass was clean, the wick trimmed. Someone had been here recently. I turned in a circle, shining my light into every corner of the room, but saw nothing. Then I heard the footsteps. They were coming from above me, slow, deliberate steps crossing from one end of the house to the other. My flashlight darted to the ceiling as the sound moved toward the top of the staircase. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper now. The footsteps stopped. The lantern, sitting on the table just a moment before, was suddenly at the foot of the stairs. Its flame flared brightly, and for a second, I thought I saw something behind it. A shadowy figure, long and thin, its head cocked to one side as if studying me. I ran. I bolted out the front door, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the dark. The truck was parked just a few hundred feet away, but as I ran, the air grew thick. My legs felt heavy, like wading through molasses. I glanced back over my shoulder and stopped dead. The farmhouse was ablaze with light, every window glowing fiercely. Figures stood in the glass, tall, thin shapes that didn't move, just watched as I struggled to breathe. And then the barn door slammed open. Something crawled out of the darkness. It was on all fours, moving unnaturally fast, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. I screamed and turned back toward the truck, pushing through whatever force was holding me back. I reached the door, fumbling for the handle, but the thing was right behind me now. I felt its breath, hot, wet, and rancid, on the back of my neck. Then the truck roared to life. I didn't start it. I wasn't even inside yet. The headlights blazed on, illuminating the creature as it lunged for me. It froze in the bright beams, its skin pale and stretched, its face a featureless mask. For a moment, neither of us moved, and then it shrieked, a sound so high and sharp, it felt like needles stabbing into my ears, and darted back toward the barn. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I threw myself into the truck, slammed the door, and peeled out of there, gravel spraying in my wake. In the rearview mirror, I saw the farmhouse lights flicker and die, one by one, until only the lantern remained, glowing faintly on the porch. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of town. I told my friends I'd lost the bet, made up some story about the place being too creepy to stay the whole night. I didn't mention the lantern, the footsteps, or the thing in the barn. I should have forgotten about it. Moved on. But last night, I woke up to find a faint yellow glow in my bedroom. The lantern was on my dresser. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The lantern sat on my dresser, its faint yellow flame steady and unmoving, the same lantern I left behind at Widow's Creek. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, that I was still out there on the farm, and all of this was a fever dream, brought on by fear and exhaustion. But when dawn broke, the light of the flame didn't dim. It stayed just as bright, a constant reminder that whatever followed me home wasn't leaving. I couldn't stay in the house. I packed what I could and drove. No destination in mind, just miles of asphalt and endless trees. The morning air was crisp, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something there, the pale, stretched face of whatever came out of that barn. But I was alone, for now. I checked into a motel on the edge of a neighboring town, telling myself this was temporary, that I could figure out what to do next once I got some sleep. But when I opened the room door, my stomach dropped. The lantern was waiting for me on the bedside table. Its flame burned just as steady, casting that sickly yellow glow. I stepped back, leaving the door open, hoping some part of me was imagining it. But when I blinked, it was still there. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the lantern and hurled it across the room, expecting it to shatter, to douse that damn flame for good. But it didn't break. It landed on the carpet with a dull thud, the flame undisturbed. And then I heard it. The footsteps. They came from above me, faint and deliberate, just like they had in the farmhouse. My heart hammered as the sound moved across the ceiling, stopping directly above where I stood. A shadow fell over the bed. It stretched impossibly tall, the head cocked at that same unnatural angle. It wasn't cast by me. It was waiting. I fled the motel. There was no plan now, just an overwhelming need to keep moving. I drove for hours, the highway blurring into a gray monotony. The lantern didn't appear in the car, and for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe I'd left it behind. Maybe it was over. Then the radio crackled to life. At first it was static, but slowly I started to hear a voice, a low, garbled whisper, almost like it was trying to speak, but couldn't quite form words. I turned the radio off, but the whispering didn't stop. It was coming from the air vents now, from the faint hum of the engine. Widow? Waiting? My grip tightened on the wheel, knuckles white as bone. The voice was clearer now, repeating those same words over and over. Widow, waiting, widow, waiting. It was nearly sunset when the truck broke down. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded on a stretch of empty road. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. When I finally got out, the landscape around me was unfamiliar. Flat fields stretched out on either side of the road, broken only by the silhouette of a barn in the distance. My blood ran cold. It was Widow's Creek. The truck wouldn't start. My phone had no signal. I was trapped, and I knew I wasn't alone. The lantern was on the hood of the truck now, its light flickering weakly in the dusk. The footsteps started again. They were closer this time, moving with purpose, circling the truck. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. A presence, heavy and oppressive, like the air itself was pressing down on me. My flashlight barely cut through the growing darkness, but I swept it in frantic arcs, trying to find the source of the sound. That's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the fields, their movements slow and jerky. They were tall and thin, their bodies stretched unnaturally, their faces blank slates of pale skin. Dozens of them all converging on the truck. I grabbed the lantern off the hood without thinking, clutching it like it might somehow protect me. The figures stopped, their heads tilting in unison toward the light. The flame flared brighter, and for a moment, they hesitated. "Leave!" I screamed, holding the lantern high. The figures shrank back, their forms dissolving into the shadows. But the moment didn't last. The flame sputtered, growing dimmer, and they began to move again. Faster this time, closing the distance with unnatural speed. I don't remember how I made it back to the farmhouse, only that I did. The lantern led me, its glow flickering through the dark, guiding me past the barn and into the house. The door slammed shut behind me, and I locked it, though I knew it wouldn't keep them out. The figures were at the windows now, their faces pressed against the glass. The lantern sat on the table where I'd first found it, its flame burning weakly. And then it spoke. "Burn it," the voice whispered, faint and hollow. "End it." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the lantern and smashed it against the floor. The oil spilled out, catching fire immediately. The flames spread fast, consuming the room, the walls, everything. The figures at the windows screamed, their cries high and inhuman, and then they were gone. I ran. The farmhouse burned behind me, a towering inferno that lit up the night. By the time I reached the edge of the property, the house had collapsed in on itself, the flames dying down to embers. I don't know what I unleashed that night, or if I stopped it. The lantern was gone, but its light still haunts me. Sometimes when the nights are quiet and the air is still, I catch a faint yellow glow out of the corner of my eye, and I wonder if it's waiting for me to come back. The night started like any other, quiet, uneventful, with a slight chill in the air as the moon hung high over the sprawling farmland. I'd agreed to watch over my friend's farm while he and his wife took a rare weekend off. The place was massive, bordered by dense woods on one side and endless cornfields on the other. I was promised nothing more than a cozy guest room and some peace. Instead, I got something I'll never forget. By midnight, the house was silent. The livestock, a handful of cows and a stubborn old mule, were already settled in the barn. I'd finished my last round through the property, locked the doors, and double-checked the generator, since the area was notorious for power outages. All seemed fine. I was halfway into a second beer, flipping channels on an old TV in the living room, when I heard it. A sharp metallic asterisk, clank asterisk, like something striking the barn door. My first thought was, raccoons. They're bold out here. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The yard stretched out into shadows, the barn standing 100 yards from the house, just beyond the motion-activated light's reach. As I stepped closer, the light snapped on. My stomach dropped. The barn door was wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Raccoons don't do that, I muttered to myself. The beam from my flashlight cut through the dark as I stepped inside. The barn smelled of hay and earth, familiar but strangely oppressive that night. The cows were agitated, shifting nervously in their pens, their eyes reflecting the light with unnatural brightness. The mule, usually indifferent to everything, let out a low, uneasy bray from the back corner. "Hello?" I called out, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I hoped whoever, or whatever, was there would just leave if they heard me. No response. Just the sound of animals shifting and the faint creak of the barn's wooden beams. Then I saw them. Footprints in the dirt floor. Bare, human-like prints. But they were wrong. The toes were too long, almost clawed, and the stride was unnatural, too far apart, like whoever made them was crawling or bounding rather than walking. I followed the tracks to the far corner of the barn, where the mule stood trembling, its ears pinned back. Beyond it was the old ladder that led up to the hayloft. The prints stopped there, but the mule's reaction told me whatever it was hadn't just disappeared. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct screamed to leave, to lock the barn, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I ignored it, whatever was lurking up there wouldn't stay contained. I climbed the ladder slowly, the wooden rungs creaking under my weight. My flashlight swept across the hayloft. It was empty at first glance, just piles of straw and old tools gathering dust. Then I noticed something odd. In the far corner, where the moonlight filtered through the slats, the hay was matted down, like something had been lying there, and next to it, scratch marks, long, deep grooves in the wood, as if made by claws. That's when I heard it, a faint clicking sound coming from above me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The barn had no second story, just the roof beams overhead. Slowly, I tilted the flashlight upward. Something was there, crouched among the beams, its pale limbs impossibly thin and long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, as if studying me. Its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, but they were too big, too human. It moved suddenly, skittering along the beams like a spider, the clicking sound growing louder as its claws scraped against the wood. I don't remember climbing down. 1 second, I was staring at it, and the next, I was sprinting toward the house, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The house felt wrong now, like it wasn't safe anymore. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Not unusual for the area, but it felt deliberate. Then, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. I could hear it now. The faint asterisk, click, click, click asterisk of claws on the porch outside. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. It wanted me to know it was there. I moved as quietly as I could, grabbing the only weapon I could find, a rusty hatchet from the fireplace tools. The sound moved to the side of the house, then the back, as if it was circling, testing the walls. Then came the worst sound yet, the creak of a window sliding open upstairs. It was in the house. My mind raced. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide that it wouldn't find me. The only option was to face it. Hatchet in hand, I crept up the stairs, every step feeling like it could be my last. The hallway stretched out in front of me, the guest room door slightly ajar. The faint moonlight spilling in showed the curtains fluttering. The window was wide open. The clicking had stopped. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty, but the bedspread was disturbed. Claw marks raked across the headboard. My pulse was deafening in my ears as I backed out of the room. That's when I felt it. Hot breath against my neck. I spun around, swinging the hatchet wildly. It caught something, the blade sinking in with a wet asterisk thunk asterisk. A screech filled the air, high-pitched and inhuman. The creature recoiled, its long limbs thrashing as it tried to pull away. I saw it clearly for the first time, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones, its face a grotesque mimicry of human features, twisted into something predatory. I didn't stop swinging until it stopped moving. When the sun rose, I buried what was left of it in the woods. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. My friend's farm looks peaceful in the daylight, but I'll never stay there again. Some things aren't meant to be explained, and some places aren't meant to be guarded alone. A week after that night, I got a call from my friend. He thanked me for watching the farm and casually asked if I noticed anything strange while I was there. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. How could I explain what happened without sounding insane? Instead of answering directly, I asked why he'd asked. His tone shifted, less casual, more guarded. "Well," he began, "we've been having issues for a while. Strange sounds in the barn, missing animals. Thought maybe it was coyotes or feral dogs, but the footprints we've found don't match anything we know. The neighbors have seen things near the woods." "Things?" I asked, my voice tight. "Yeah, like figures. Too tall, too thin, running on all fours. One of the neighbors swears it looked right at him. They won't come near the property now." He laughed nervously. "Honestly, I figured it was just their imagination until we started losing livestock." I gripped the phone tighter, my pulse quickening. "Why didn't you tell me this before I stayed there?" There was a long pause. "I didn't want to scare you off. Besides, we figured it was just animals. Nothing that'd bother a person, you know?" I didn't respond. My thoughts were spiraling back to that night, to the thing in the barn, its impossible limbs, the way it moved, how it felt too smart, too aware. "Hey," he added, "we're putting the place up for sale. The wife and I decided it's not worth the stress. Whoever buys it can deal with whatever's out there." That was the last time I heard from him. The farm sold within a month, and I heard the new owners moved in without issue. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. I tried to convince myself that whatever I'd faced that night was gone, that maybe I'd killed it. But deep down, I knew better. About 3 months later, I was back in the city, starting to feel normal again. Then one evening, as I was locking up my apartment for the night, I heard it. A faint asterisk, click, 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 asterisk, from somewhere in the hallway. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, staring at the peephole in my door, expecting to see something staring back. But when I finally worked up the courage to look, the hallway was empty. The sound stopped. But now, every night when it's quiet, I listen for it. Sometimes I think I hear it, just at the edge of perception. A soft, rhythmic asterisk, click, 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 asterisk, like claws on wood, like it's waiting for me. And I know one thing for sure: whatever it is, it doesn't stay on the farm. You'd think that driving an 18-wheeler through endless highways at night would make you immune to fear. I mean, I've seen it all. Road rage, accidents, even a guy walking naked on Route 66 like he was auditioning for a horror flick. But what happened last month? That wasn't the usual trucker nightmare. That was something else. Something wrong. I'm hauling cargo across Nebraska, about 2 a.m. The road is a strip of black slicing through miles of flat nothingness. It's quiet except for the steady hum of the rig's engine, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts wander to dark places. Then, my CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19, you out there?" The voice was low, shaky. I hesitated. Usually it's other truckers chatting about routes, weather, or just swapping jokes to kill the boredom. But something in his voice had me grabbing the mic. "Yeah, this is Long Haul. What's up?" Static hissed for a moment before his reply came through. I I think I'm being followed." "Followed?" I asked, gripping the wheel tighter. My eyes scanned the rearview mirrors out of reflex, even though I knew the highway behind me was empty. "You sure about that? Ain't nobody out here but us." The radio crackled again, and his voice came through more frantic this time. "It's not a car. I don't know what it is. It's been tailing me since mile marker 240. Every time I look back, it's closer." "Closer? What are you seeing, man?" I asked, feeling a bead of sweat roll down my temple. Nebraska highways don't exactly have streetlights, and whatever he was dealing with was probably some stray animal or a trick of the dark. He didn't answer right away. Instead, there was a long pause, filled only with static, before he finally whispered, "Eyes." "Eyes?" I repeated, my stomach tightening. "Yeah," he said, his voice trembling. "Like headlights, but wrong. Too low to the ground, and they flicker, like they're blinking. I swear to God, man, it's watching me." I glanced at my GPS. Mile marker 240 was about 10 miles behind me. Whatever was happening to this guy, it wasn't far off. "All right, buddy, stay calm. Where are you now?" "Just past mile marker 250. It's still back there, but it's closer. I can feel it." His voice cracked, and for the first time, I heard real terror in his words. This wasn't just highway paranoia. He truly believed something was after him. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a rest stop at 255. Bright lights, other truckers. Head there, and I'll meet you." "No," he snapped, almost yelling. "It won't let me stop. Every time I slow down, it gets closer. I can hear it, like claws scraping the pavement." My blood ran cold. I turned on my high beams, as if that would somehow protect me. "What's your rig?" I asked. "I'll look for you on the road." "Freightliner Cascadia. White cab, red trailer," he muttered. "But I don't think you'll make it in time." Then the radio went dead. I grabbed the mic again. "Breaker 19, you there? Talk to me." Static hissed in response. My heart pounded as I pushed the accelerator, the engine growling as the truck surged forward. I was determined to catch up to him, or at least see what the hell was going on. At mile marker 252, I spotted him. A white Freightliner with a red trailer barreled down the highway ahead of me, swerving erratically. His brake lights flickered, as though he was trying to stop, but couldn't. Then I saw them. Eyes. Two faint yellowish glows, low to the ground, darting in and out of the darkness behind his trailer. They weren't headlights. They were alive. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my palms slick against the steering wheel. The glowing orbs moved like they were studying him, stalking him. Then, they shifted focus. To me. I felt my chest tighten as the eyes blinked, slowly, deliberately, and locked onto my truck. Suddenly, the Freightliner veered off the road, its horn blaring in a panicked howl. It disappeared into the cornfields, leaving me alone with whatever had been chasing it. The glowing eyes began to speed up, closing the distance between us. I floored it. My rig groaned under the strain, the speedometer climbing past limits I knew weren't safe for a truck this size. But the eyes kept up, growing brighter, hungrier. The road ahead blurred as adrenaline coursed through me. Then I heard it. A scraping, like metal on asphalt. It wasn't coming from my rig. It was coming from underneath it. My radio came back to life with an ear-splitting burst of static. A voice came through, distorted and guttural, nothing like the man I'd been speaking to earlier. "You can't outrun it." The sound of claws raked across my trailer, and I felt the whole truck shudder. I gritted my teeth, swerving wildly to shake whatever was beneath me. The weight shifted, and I nearly lost control, the trailer fishtailing dangerously close to the edge of the road. Up ahead, the rest stop appeared like a beacon of hope, its floodlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The eyes vanished just as I burst into the parking lot, skidding to a halt amid a few other rigs. My hands trembled as I killed the engine and jumped out of the cab. Nothing. No glowing eyes. No claws. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chirp of crickets. Other truckers looked at me like I was crazy as I inspected the underside of my truck. Deep gouges ran along the metal, like something with claws had been clinging to it. My legs felt like jelly as I slumped against the side of the cab, breathing hard. "Hey, you all right?" one of the truckers asked, stepping closer. I opened my mouth to speak, but froze when I saw it. Out in the distance, just beyond the edge of the floodlights, two faint yellow eyes blinked. Then they disappeared into the darkness. I quit long hauls the next day. Let me tell you something. Long-haul trucking is not for the faint of heart, not just because of the endless miles or the isolation, but because of the things you see at night. I've been on the road for over 15 years, driving through every back road, highway, and nowhere town you can imagine. Nothing shakes me easily, but one night, one stretch of black asphalt made me question everything. It was a clear autumn night when I picked up a late delivery from a warehouse in Kentucky, heading west to Missouri. The load wasn't anything out of the ordinary, crates of furniture, some tools, but the route took me through a patch of the Appalachians that's more shadows than road after dark. Truckers call it the Devil's Backbone. Why? Because people and vehicles disappear there. But nobody ever really talks about it. We just drive. As I crossed into the mountains, the CB radio crackled. A gruff voice, another trucker said, "Breaker 19, anyone rolling through Backbone tonight might want to steer clear." Silence. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. Superstitions, I muttered to myself. Besides, I had a deadline to meet. An hour later, the road narrowed. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick trees overhead. My headlights fought against the ink-like darkness. The forest leaned too close, like it was watching. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, a shape darted into the road. I slammed on the brakes, my trailer screeching and groaning behind me. The truck stopped inches from what looked like a deer? No, not a deer. It was too tall, too thin. The thing turned its head toward me, and I swear its face wasn't right. Black eyes, like a doll's eyes, and its mouth, jagged like it had too many teeth. It tilted its head almost curiously before lurching away into the woods. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white. My instincts screamed to keep driving, but my engine stalled. That's when I saw the scratches. 3 deep parallel gashes raked across my hood. Fresh, the kind no animal leaves behind. The CB buzzed again, but it wasn't static this time. A low growl came through, like an animal, or a man imitating one. "Still rolling, driver?" A voice rasped, half laughing, half snarling. I was about to radio back, demand who it was, but the air in the cab grew cold. Breath fogged in front of me, though my heater was blasting full, and the forest, so loud with crickets and wind minutes before, had gone dead silent. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, slow, something big, something deliberate. I refused to look out the window, but in my mirror, I saw the outline of something. Something tall, too tall. It stood just beyond the reach of my brake lights, watching. A gut instinct I'd never felt before screamed at me to stay in the cab. The truck finally roared back to life. I floored it, the trailer swaying as I tore through the twists and turns. The further I got, the more the feeling of being hunted lessened. But it wasn't over. 30 miles later, I pulled into a rest stop. One of those desolate lots with a vending machine and a flickering light. Another rig was parked there, engine off, but no driver in sight. I stepped out, my boots crunching gravel, and checked my hood. Those gashes. They weren't just scratches anymore. They were smoking, smoldering like they'd been branded into the metal. And then, from the woods beside the lot, came a laugh. Not a man's laugh, not a child's laugh. It was distorted, like a tape player chewing on a bad recording. The hairs on my arms stood on end. "Driver," the same voice from the CB crooned, but this time it wasn't over the radio. It was in the air, behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Just my truck, just the woods. But deep in those trees, I swear, I saw eyes. Not two, dozens, blinking in unison. I didn't stay to find out what they belonged to. I climbed back into my rig, locked the doors, and drove until dawn. When I finally reached Missouri, the scratches on my hood were gone, replaced by pristine metal, like nothing had ever happened. But I know what I saw. And every time I pass through Appalachia, I see those same blinking eyes in my nightmares. If you're driving through the Devil's Backbone, keep your eyes forward, your windows shut, and don't stop for anything. A week passed, but the shadows of that night followed me. Truck stops felt quieter than usual, the roads darker, and the CB radio, even when silent, felt ominous. The scratches may have disappeared from my truck, but the memory of them burned in my mind. And then, the real nightmare began. My next haul was a routine trip, heading south toward Alabama, a midnight run. As always, I preferred driving at night. Less traffic, more peace. But peace was the last thing I found. It started with my GPS going haywire. One moment it showed a straight route. The next, my truck icon spun wildly, as if I'd veered off-road. I checked my map, recalibrated, and pushed on. That's when I noticed something. The mile markers weren't right. Each marker was different. One read 142, then the next said 666. I laughed it off, thinking I was seeing things. But the markers grew stranger. End. Turn back. And one that simply read run. The rational part of me fought to dismiss it. A prank, bad lighting, or exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. And then I saw the rig. It was pulled over on the shoulder, headlights blazing. The truck looked abandoned, door swinging gently in the breeze. I slowed, radioing out of habit. "Breaker 19, you need a hand, driver." Static. The closer I got, the more I noticed something wasn't right. The rig's cab was empty, but the trailer doors hung open, swaying like something or someone had forced them apart. What stopped me cold was the graffiti scrawled across the trailer in thick black letters. "Nothing leaves." I slammed the accelerator. My rig roared forward, the abandoned truck disappearing in my mirror. About 10 minutes later, my CB crackled. "You left something behind, driver." A voice whispered, raspy and wet, like someone speaking underwater. "Who is this?" I snapped, my voice shaking. Silence. Then another sound, a scraping, like nails on metal. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't coming from the CB. It was coming from the trailer. Whatever it was, it had hitched a ride. My headlights caught a curve in the road ahead, forcing me to slow down. The scraping grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was back there knew I was easing up. I gripped the wheel, heart pounding, until I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over, leaving the engine running, and grabbed my flashlight. As I stepped out, the night wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. The air was heavy, too quiet. I circled to the rear of the trailer, every crunch of gravel under my boots echoing too loud. My flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it at the doors. Deep gouges raked across the metal, forming patterns. No, symbols. My hands were sweating, but I reached for the handle. The moment I unlatched it, the doors flew open, and someone lunged at me. I stumbled back, falling hard on the asphalt. It was a man, or what used to be one. His skin was gray and stretched taut, his eyes sunken, but blazing with a sickly yellow light. His mouth twisted into an inhuman grin as he crawled toward me on all fours, faster than any human should. I scrambled back, yelling, "Stay the hell away!" But he didn't stop. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings, and his grin widened impossibly as he reached out. That's when I heard it. The sound of tires screeching, a horn blaring, and then the crunch of impact. Another truck coming around the bend had plowed into the figure, throwing it into the ditch. I staggered to my feet, breathing hard, as the driver of the other rig jumped out. "You okay?" he asked, looking me over. I pointed to the ditch, but when we checked, the thing was gone. Only a smear of dark, oily blood remained. We didn't talk much after that. The other driver offered to follow me to the nearest truck stop, and I didn't argue. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the entire time, I felt those eyes on me, watching, waiting. When I reached the stop, I parked, climbed into the sleeper, and locked every door. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness, that thing was still lurking. I never drove through the Devil's Backbone again, and I'll never forget the lesson I learned that night. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 2:43 a.m. The highway was dead, a straight ribbon of asphalt vanishing into the darkness. My CB radio crackled faintly with static, the voices of distant truckers trading stories to stay awake. I adjusted my cap and yawned, the hum of my 18-wheeler lulling me into a dangerous sense of calm. Then, out of nowhere, a voice broke through the static. "Eastbound on I-70. Anyone else seeing this?" The voice was shaky, breathless, like someone who just ran a marathon. I grabbed the mic. "Eastbound here. What's going on?" Static swallowed his reply, but I heard enough to send chills down my spine. "Black semi. No lights. Coming up fast." I shifted in my seat, suddenly wide awake. My headlights illuminated nothing but the road ahead, bordered by skeletal trees and the occasional mile marker. I checked my rearview mirrors. Nothing but empty black. "Anyone else out there?" The voice called again, this time frantic. "Calm down," I said into the mic. "Where are you exactly?" I think mile marker 82. It's behind me." "Oh God, it's right on me." The transmission cut out with a burst of static. My heart thudded against my rib cage. Mile marker 82 was about 10 miles ahead. I pressed harder on the gas, my truck rumbling as it picked up speed. I don't know why I felt compelled to go faster. Curiosity? Duty? Or maybe some primal part of me was already screaming, "You should turn back." 10 minutes later, I reached marker 82. The asphalt gleamed under my headlights, but the road ahead was empty. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter. My CB buzzed again, but it was faint this time, almost garbled. "Don't stop." The message made my skin crawl. I rolled my window down slightly, letting in the cold air. That's when I noticed something. The faint sound of a horn, long and mournful, echoing in the distance. It wasn't coming from the highway ahead. It was coming from behind me. I checked my mirrors again. This time, there it was. Far in the distance, but unmistakable. A massive black semi, its outline barely visible against the night. No headlights, no running lights, just a hulking shadow on wheels. My pulse spiked as I grabbed the CB mic. "Whoever's out there, is this some kind of joke?" I asked. but my voice betrayed the fear clawing at my throat. The response came in a whisper so faint I had to strain to hear it. "It's not a truck. Don't stop. Don't let it catch you." The shadow in my mirrors grew larger. It was closing in, fast. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the roar of my engine filling the cab. My trailer swayed as my speed climbed past 80, then 85. But no matter how fast I went, the black semi kept gaining. Its horn blasted low and guttural, vibrating through my chest. It wasn't the horn of any truck I'd ever heard. It sounded almost alive. The CB crackled again, and the faint whisper returned. "Don't look at it. Whatever you do, don't look at it." I didn't want to, but when the thing roared up beside me, I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head. The cab of the black semi was empty. No driver, just a void where a driver should have been. The windows weren't tinted. They were black holes, devouring the light of my headlights. The truck's grille was bent into a wicked snarl, like some kind of metal maw. I yanked my eyes back to the road and slammed the accelerator harder. My truck groaned under the strain. The black semi swerved, its shadowy mass brushing against my trailer. Sparks flew, lighting the darkness like fireworks. "Get off the highway," the CB hissed. There was an exit up ahead, barely lit by a single flickering lamp. Without thinking, I veered toward it, tires screeching as I took the turn too fast. My truck wobbled but held steady as I barreled down the narrow exit ramp and onto a deserted country road. For a moment, I thought I'd lost it. The road stretched out empty before me, flanked by fields of tall grass swaying in the wind. My shoulders sagged with relief. But then the horn sounded again, closer this time, and my blood ran cold. In my side mirror, I saw it. The black semi was following me off the highway. "Leave me alone," I shouted into the CB, but the static gave no reply. The road grew narrower, twisting and turning through the darkness. The black semi's headlights, no, the absence of headlights, loomed behind me, swallowing the faint glow of the moon. Up ahead I saw it, a bridge, old, rickety, and far too narrow for two trucks. I didn't slow down. If the thing wanted to take me out, it would have to follow me across. The bridge groaned as my truck rolled onto it. Wooden planks creaked and snapped under my weight. I made it halfway across before I heard a deafening crash behind me. I glanced in the mirror and saw the black semi barreling onto the bridge. Its sheer size was too much for the old structure. The wood splintered and the bridge began to collapse. I floored it, the edge of the bridge just a few yards away. The black semi's horn blared one last time, a guttural scream that sent chills down my spine. Then the bridge gave out entirely. I felt my rear tires hit solid ground, just as the rest of the bridge crumbled into the river below. I slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop, my chest heaving. Behind me, the black semi disappeared into the churning water, its horn fading into silence. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the empty road ahead. The CB crackled once more, a final whisper cutting through the static. "You made it, but it'll be back." I never took that route again. Hell, I've never driven at night since. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't a truck. And if it ever comes for you, don't stop. Don't look at it, just run. Any other. A dispatch about a disturbance on Lincoln Avenue. A rundown stretch of road I've driven 1,000 times. Routine, I thought. But nothing about that night would be routine. I'm an officer, and my job is to answer calls, no matter how bizarre they might sound. The caller reported screams, frantic footsteps, and what they described as shadows chasing shadows. Dispatch didn't think it sounded credible, but they sent me anyway. Pulling onto Lincoln Avenue at 3 a.m., I slowed to a crawl. The street was empty, the kind of silence that presses on your ears until you swear you're hearing whispers. My patrol car's headlights cut through the night, bouncing off the cracked windows of old shops and boarded-up buildings. Then I saw her, a woman sprinting down the middle of the street. She was barefoot, wearing a torn dress, her face twisted in sheer terror. I rolled down my window to call out to her, but before I could, she stopped dead in her tracks, her neck snapping around like she'd heard something I couldn't. She screamed, and that's when I saw it. Something moving behind her. But there was nothing there. Not at first. I jumped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and yelled for her to stop. She ran toward me, sobbing, begging for help. Her words were a jumbled mess, but I caught bits and pieces. It's coming. Invisible. It touched me. Suddenly, she was lifted off the ground. No hands, no wires, nothing. Just her body, rising like a marionette. Her feet dangled in the air as her screams turned to choking gasps. My instinct was to run to her, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like the air around me had turned solid. I could only watch as her body twisted unnaturally, her arms and legs contorting in directions they shouldn't go. Then, her head snapped. She fell to the pavement in a heap, lifeless. The silence returned, thick and heavy. My radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. I approached her cautiously, flashlight shaking in my grip. Her wide, glassy eyes stared up at me, mouth frozen, mid-scream. There were bruises around her neck, bruises that didn't look like they came from human hands. I called for backup, but deep down, I knew no one would believe what I just saw. As I waited, something caught my eye, a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off asphalt. It hovered where the woman had been lifted. My heart pounded as I reached for my gun. The shimmer moved toward me, slow and deliberate. I fired. The bullet hit something. The shimmer flared, twisting like a living thing in pain, then vanished. But the air didn't feel any lighter. Whatever was out there, I knew it wasn't gone. When backup arrived, I didn't tell them everything, just that I found her like that. The official report chalked it up to a hit and run, the case marked unsolved. But I couldn't let it go. That was the night I learned about the Tartarus Archive. But that's a story for another time. For now, just remember, not everything you see on Lincoln Avenue is real, and some things you don't see are more real than you'd like to believe. Weeks passed, but the image of that woman's body didn't leave me. Every night, I drove down Lincoln Avenue on my patrol, scanning for something, anything, to make sense of what happened. But the street stayed empty, a scar on the city's map. I became obsessed. I started digging through old police files, hoping for patterns. Reports of disappearances on Lincoln Avenue dated back decades. Most were written off as runaways, accidents, or unexplainable events buried under paperwork. But some officers, those who worked late shifts on the avenue, had left chilling notes in the margins of reports. Felt watched, couldn't see anything, but it was there. I tried to share my concerns with my partner, but he brushed it off. "Don't go looking for ghosts," he said. But I couldn't stop. One night, my obsession nearly killed me. I was parked on the avenue, engine off, windows cracked. It was quiet, too quiet. Then, a sound, a faint hum, like static, but coming from nowhere. My skin prickled. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and looked around. That's when I saw the shimmer again. It was closer this time, less subtle. The air seemed to bend around it, distorting the empty street like a funhouse mirror. My gut screamed at me to get back in the car, but something about it was magnetic. Against all reason, I stepped closer. The shimmer moved. It was fast, darting down the street like a predator circling its prey. My flashlight flickered, then died. My gun felt useless in my holster. And then, I heard the whisper. "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was in my head, but louder than my thoughts. I stumbled back, the whisper growing into a deafening roar. Shapes began to form in the shimmer, elongated limbs, hollow eyes, twisted mouths that didn't belong on any living creature. They flickered in and out of existence, like they couldn't fully cross into our reality. I ran. Back in the car, I threw it into drive and sped off. My radio crackled, voices cutting in and out. "Officer down on Lincoln Avenue." The voice wasn't mine. When I reported the incident, I was met with silence. My captain gave me a long, hard look, then dismissed me for the night. 2 days later, I was called into his office. He handed me a file labeled Classified Tartarus Division. Inside were grainy stills from security footage, the woman I'd seen that night, the shimmer, and other images, faces contorted in terror, bodies suspended in midair, shadows that didn't belong to anything human. He said only one thing: "You didn't see anything." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I combed through the Tartarus file in secret. There were names of other officers, all with eerily similar accounts, all sworn to silence. A few had gone missing. That's when I found the recording. It was from a patrol car on Lincoln Avenue, time-stamped 5 years ago. The dash cam footage showed an empty street at first. Then, the shimmer appeared. The car's engine revved, but the officer never escaped. The shimmer enveloped the vehicle, and within seconds, the footage cut to static. The officer was never found. I requested a transfer the next day. Now, years later, I'm hundreds of miles away from Lincoln Avenue, but the whispers still haunt me. Sometimes when it's quiet, I'll hear the hum, faint but unmistakable. I've learned to ignore it. But if you ever find yourself driving down Lincoln Avenue late at night, and the air feels heavy, like it's pressing down on your chest, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. First time I saw her was through the cracked screen of a police body cam. Dispatch, suspect unarmed but acting erratic. The officer muttered as his footsteps echoed down the shadowed alley, his breath clouded in the frigid night air. Every exhale, a whisper of tension. The camera bobbed with his steps, capturing the shimmer of frost on the brick walls and the distant glow of streetlights. Then she appeared. She was crouched by a dumpster, her back to the officer, swaying ever so slightly like she was listening to music only she could hear. Her hair, long and dark, clung to her like seaweed on a corpse. The officer called out, his voice steady but sharp. "Ma'am, this is the police. Are you all right?" She didn't turn around. Instead, she raised a single hand, a pale skeletal thing with fingers too long, almost insect-like, and scratched the air. Slowly, methodically, like she was carving something unseen into the fabric of the night. "Ma'am," the officer repeated, more urgent now. He stepped closer, boots crunching on broken glass. That's when she moved. She didn't stand or turn around. She simply twisted. Her neck rotated far beyond what should have been possible, vertebrae cracking like dry twigs, until her face was staring back at the camera. Her eyes were enormous, hollow pits, swallowing the weak beam of the officer's flashlight. And her mouth, God, her mouth, stretched into a grin that could split a human skull. The body cam glitched. For a moment, the screen was static, the audio a shrill, grating scream. When the feed returned, the alley was empty. The woman was gone. "Officer Monroe, what's your status?" Dispatch buzzed, but Monroe wasn't responding. His body cam showed nothing but the open alley now, the flashlight beam trembling as it panned across damp brick walls. Then, with a wet, guttural crunch, the camera fell sideways. The last thing it captured before going dark was a streak of blood pooling into the frost. I shouldn't have seen that footage, but I did. And now she's found me. For 3 days after seeing that footage, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my apartment, every shadow caught in the corner of my eye felt alive, as if it carried the echo of her grin. Monroe's body was never found. The official report chalked it up to gang violence in the area, but I knew better. That thing, whatever it was, had taken him. I work in law enforcement too, just not on the front lines. My job was to review body cam footage for ongoing investigations, compiling evidence for court cases. After Monroe's footage, I told myself I'd misinterpreted what I saw. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a camera malfunction, or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But the night after I filed the footage, I got a message in my inbox. Unreviewed Incident 1127 code, redacted. It was flagged for immediate review, a case assigned to me, and only me. At first, I thought it was a mistake. No one spoke to me about it. No directives came through, just the video file. I shouldn't have clicked on it, but I did. This wasn't from Monroe's district. The footage came from across the city, 3 nights after his disappearance. It showed 2 officers responding to a break-in at a derelict industrial warehouse. Their body cams revealed the scene: rusted machines coated in dust, walls lined with graffiti, and corridors that seemed to stretch forever into the dark. "Anyone here? Show yourself," one officer barked, his flashlight slicing through the shadows. His partner covered his 6, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. And then they heard it. Laughter. It was faint at first, barely audible. A child's giggle. But as they moved deeper, it grew louder, distorted, the pitch warping until it sounded less like laughter and more like the twisted cries of something mocking human joy. "Cut the crap," the second officer shouted. "This is your last warning." The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness around them. That's when the flashlight beams caught movement. Something darted between the rusted machines, too fast to track. The officers shouted, raising their weapons, but it was no use. The thing emerged, not running, but crawling, limbs too long, joints bending the wrong way. It skittered toward them with impossible speed, its hollow eyes reflecting the light like mirrors. One officer fired. The gunshots echoed, deafening in the emptiness. The creature stopped, crouched on all fours, and cocked its head. It didn't bleed. It didn't fall. It simply stared, grinning that same skull-splitting grin. Then it lunged. The camera feed erupted into chaos. Flashes of limbs, screams, static. The footage ended abruptly. I shut my laptop, heart pounding. My apartment felt suffocatingly quiet. Too quiet. And then I heard it. A faint scratching noise. At first I thought it was coming from the walls, maybe rats or the old pipes. But as I sat there frozen, I realized it wasn't the walls. It was my window. I turned slowly. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the silhouette behind them. Something tall, with fingers too long, was tracing patterns in the glass. Slowly, methodically. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, staring at that shadow. Minutes. Hours. Finally, I mustered the courage to reach for my phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? "There's someone outside my window," I whispered. "Can you describe them?" The scratching stopped. The blinds fluttered, as if touched by a faint breeze. Then slowly, they began to part. "No," I stammered. No. Sir, are you there? Sir? It was her. That face. That impossible grin. Her hollow eyes bore into mine as she pressed her palms flat against the glass, her nails scraping in a slow, deliberate rhythm. She leaned closer, her grin widening, until the corners of her mouth began to tear. I dropped the phone. I don't remember what happened next. One moment I was in my living room. The next I was sprinting down the fire escape, barefoot and half-dressed, into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest precinct, pounding on the doors like a lunatic. When they finally let me in, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but no one believed me. The footage from Monroe's body cam, gone. The unreviewed file, deleted from the system. They pulled up my personnel file,